Great.
Professor just stopped to teaching.
Okay, so hello everybody, and I'm really happy that today Professor Paolo Graziano is here from Padua University, and I think Paolo can introduce himself a little bit more, but I can tell main facts that I could Google on you, Paolo. Yeah. So, a professor of political science at University of Padua and a research associate at the European Social Observatory in Brussels, and a research fellow of University of Surrey and Sciences Po in Paris. Is that correct?
Perfect.
Yes. And the main subjects Paolo teaches is in political science and communication and public management and multi-level governance. And we have lectures of Paolo today and tomorrow. And I welcome everyone who is here as well as online. And we have two main topics, I would say. So today is for the topic of eco-social welfare state. I think for Lithuania as well as for our program, it's quite a new topic and still a lot to be discovered. Also associated with the European Green Transition, which is a lot on the political agenda. And tomorrow we'll have lectures on EU social policy change and welfare state development in a comparative setting. So I think that's it for my introduction. Maybe Paolo, you can introduce yourself a bit more. And are you comfortable? Everything is here?
Perfect.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right? Yeah. And students are very similar all over the world, and typically they tend to stay at the end of the room. I always ask, since it's not a huge audience, if ever you want to come in front, it's going to be easier for me, but I again leave it to you as you wish. Thank you for those who will do it. As long as you can hear me. As we were discussing this over lunch, another issue that we always try to focus on when we start our lectures is, what do we do with our mobile phones? How do we treat them, right? Because they're a distracting object that we all have. And I usually show my device, and this is, as you can see also from the far end of the room, this is archaeology, pure archaeology. But I also do it in order to avoid temptations, because as you know, we are typically spending about 3 hours, especially the youth, 3 hours, 3.5 hours on the mobiles, which is fully understandable. But during the lectures, what I kindly ask you to do is just to forget your mobile phones, and if ever you have questions, do not even Google the questions on your computers if you have any, but just let's keep it as collective as possible. So if there are any issues, any points that are not clear, just stop me and I will be more than happy to clarify things. As you can imagine, I'm very, very happy to be here. I really thank Ekaterina and the staff of the university that invited me. I'm really very grateful. It's most likely the beginning of an exchange that we will develop in the future years. So I come from the University of Padova, or the University of Padua, depending on how you want to read it. Italian is Padova, the international is Padua. And how many of you know where Padua is? A couple, right? But how many of you know where Venice is? Exactly. So when we typically say where Padua is, 20 minutes from Venice, because everybody knows where Venice is, and just a few, as it happened on this occasion, know where Padua is. But nevertheless, it's a beautiful city, and it has a very ancient university. I'm hosted in a very ancient university. Padua was founded in 2022, so it's one of the most ancient universities. I'm a professor of political science, as it has been stated very kindly by the professor who introduced me, and I have worked a lot on European social policy, and increasingly I'm working on the eco-welfare states and eco-social policies and politics. We will have today and tomorrow to explore this, if you will bear with me. And my main focus now is exactly trying to understand if the research agenda I'm sharing with other colleagues, we have some research projects that have been funded, and we're working on this in a comparative fashion, so it's also, for me, very important and interesting to have feedback from you coming from a country that I do not know that well. Of course, we did include it, as you'll see, in one of our studies, because we had a large N comparative study where we did what I'm going to present today, a cluster analysis. And therefore, Lithuania is in there, but this does not mean that I know that much about Lithuania. I just know some indicators that we've used to conduct our analysis that I will show you later. But all this to say that feel more than free to stop me whenever you want, ask me questions, criticize me, comments, whatever, observations, or even share experience or thoughts, because I really truly believe that learning experiences are such only if there is interaction, exchange. As you can imagine, I could go on for hours talking and talking and talking and talking, but you would get bored and bored and bored and bored. So the point is not to bore you. On the contrary, hopefully, is to trigger some interest or to consolidate some intellectual curiosities that you may have. So once again, do stop me whenever you want. I don't know how many of you are going to go through all the lectures, but these lectures were built as follows. We're going to start today with two presentations. The first is on, as you see from the title, slightly different from the original one. It's eco-social welfare states, or state, an exploratory analysis. Then we will continue with a focus on the European Union. And we will focus in particular on the European Green Deal that I'm sure you're all at least partially familiar with. And I'll try to make the argument that the European Green Deal was first formulated and then adopted for very specific legitimation-based reasons that are also connected to the need at the European Union level to connect social policies and environmental policies. But this will be the second part of today's lectures, where tomorrow we will go a bit more into the topics you're following as master students or as bachelor students, social policy. More specifically, we will look at European social policy, how it changed over time and how it has been developing in very recent times. And then we will wrap it up with opening the spectrum and focusing on other countries, other continents, and try to develop some explanatory reading of developments in welfare states in Europe and beyond. So quite ambitious to a certain extent. I also sent yesterday some papers that I didn't want you to read beforehand, because I know you have other things that you have to prepare, you have to work on. But there'll be 6 papers, I think, that are somehow summarizing most of the things I'm going to say. Actually, they're pieces of work. 5 articles out of 6 are articles I wrote or wrote with colleagues. Only one is of another colleague. So basically, it's what I'm going to say today and tomorrow, but you'll have more references if you're interested. You'll have more information in order then to criticize our work in a more thorough manner if ever you want to do so. So, eco-social welfare states. Let me start with a question. Eco-social, what is it? What would you think that we're going to focus on? I know most of you are more or less not forced to be here, but you know, it's a lecture, we have to go. But at the same time, if you did see the title, you might have asked yourself, what are we going to talk about? So maybe most of you know what the topic is, but then let's start from what you think or what you know. So if we had to, let's see if the pointer works. No, it doesn't matter anyway. Should be the top one, right? Yeah. Yeah, but if it doesn't work, it doesn't matter. Yeah, it should work. No, yeah, but yeah, just wanted the pointer with the typically there's a light.
No, just these ones. And this one.
Yeah, that one.
Oh.
That's the one I wanted to use, but if it doesn't work,
somehow
doesn't matter. Okay, so just pretend there's a lighter here going right here. So, eco-social. We added something to welfare states. You all know what a welfare state is. I'm not going to be here telling you what a welfare state is because you would say, why did you come from Padova to tell us something we know? Hopefully, I'll tell you something else. So why eco-social? What would you, just, again, very freely, whatever you have in mind, it can be anything. Because social welfare state is a bit redundant, right? Because we know that a welfare state is a set of policies that are aimed at confronting social challenges, correct? So this is what we all know. So social welfare is redundant, but if we put eco-social, we are interpreting the welfare state in a slightly different manner. So how would, if you went to see your friends for a coffee later, said, okay, what were your expectations about eco-social? Yes? Okay, I saw a hand up, but it wasn't really that up. I know it's always difficult to begin, but then once you start, typically you cannot be stopped anymore, so it's... Okay, I'll start, just to make sure that we... Yes, I'm sorry, didn't see you, go ahead.
Now we live in a world in which we have a lot of ecological problems.
Yeah.
I think that when we are talking about eco-social welfare state, it is important that when we are solving these ecological problems, anyone shouldn't be left behind.
So this is exactly very, very simple to a certain extent, but very important on the other extent. There's the notion, looking at environmental policy, of the just transition. This is going to be the one we're going to focus on looking at the European Union. And we also have just transition plans in various countries, in Lithuania as well, because it's complying to a European policy, but we'll talk about this later on. So when we're thinking about eco-social welfare states, we're thinking about provisions of policies that are not only focusing on social goals, but are also considering, typically in an integrated way, that is, interconnected way, also environmental goals, on the one hand. On the other hand, if we're thinking about eco-social welfare states, we're also thinking about considering the consequences that environmental policies may have on social policies and vice versa. The consequences of environmental policies the consequences of social policies on environmental policy. So, can anybody think about an example of a social policy that has consequences on the environment? And then we will focus on the other direction. So a social policy that has a consequence on the environment. Just think about a classic and very important policy. Social assistance, social benefits, providing, thank you very much, wonderful. Yay, so now we have it. So just think about providing unemployment benefits, right? All things you know. So if unemployment benefits are just given, 500 euros, are given to a recipient, this is welfare state, correct? But if you try to say that these 500 euros have to be spent, for example, on local products that are organically grown and therefore have a minor ecological footprint, or they have to be spent on clothes that do not travel the world 5 times to reach Vilnius and can therefore have an ecological footprint which is much less. You see the point? So 500 euros that can have a different ecological footprint depending on a number of conditions. I'm not saying that this is to be done, to be clear. This is, analytically speaking, if we start developing the linkage between ecological and social issues, it's an example. Of course, if we take this very seriously, then we would never have unconditional benefits, because all the benefits will have to be conditional on a number of things, typically income or wealth or whatever, on the unemployment status, but it would also have to be conditional with reference to environmental targets, which, seen from a deservingness perspective, and I'm using a term that you should be familiar with, from a deservingness perspective could be seen as problematic, because it's not a welfare anymore, but it becomes a compulsory behavior that has to be done in order for a specific benefit to be provided. So it's tightening conditionality on the one hand. But just to get the idea, you have some policies that could go in a different environmental direction. So those 500 euros could be spent, if not in an ecologically neutral way, in a very low impact on the environment if a number of conditions are put in place. Okay? So this is one social policy consequences on the environment. But then on the other hand, we have even more visible policies. How many of you heard about the yellow jackets, or the so-called, in French, gilets jaunes? 2019, early 2020. Who are they? And again, I saw that you were nodding, so I'm sure you know.
I just know about strikes. There were
Go ahead.
a lot of strikes, especially in Paris.
Perfect, indeed. It was a protest movement between 2019 and early 2020 that then was blocked, not because policies changed, but because COVID came in. And every Saturday, they were occupying multiple places, thousands of squares and round points in France. And they were saying, we are against an environmental measure that was going to raise the cost of fuel. And who were these gilets jaunes? They were very normal French citizens that we could easily put into the middle class. They were not lower income necessarily, but they were middle to low income classes that actually were going to pay a high cost with reference to the policy, because they would have had a greater burden, especially for those not living in Paris, with reference to the people living in Paris. Why? Paris, 10 million inhabitants, France has altogether about 60 million. Paris is very well served by public transportation. So the Parisians would have not had to bear the cost that all the others, or many of the others, would have to bear because they had to commute on a daily basis using the car. Okay, so this is an example of an environmental policy that has disproportional consequences on the population. Therefore, some of the most vulnerable, some of the gilets jaunes actually were vulnerable, but not the most vulnerable. They were not homeless. But still, as you know very well, the middle class can cover 80% of the population, right? So it's a very vast concept, and we could spend hours in trying to define it, by the way. But anyway, you have a huge proportion of the population that, especially in the lower middle income parts, have greater problems in coping with environmental policies when environmental policies are decided. Okay? Everything clear so far? Consequences go in one direction, but also in the other direction. Let me give you another example of environmental issues. We will see tomorrow that in Lithuania there are 3 areas that are going to benefit of European funds in order to support the just transition. And these areas, just like in many other European countries, are areas, at least parts of them, are areas that need to decarbonize. That means that they have to change, they have to transform or transit towards another type of economy which is more green, so to speak. But obviously this may have consequences. Think about companies or think about mines or factories that are very carbon intensive and therefore pollute a lot. And if you want to close the companies, then what would be the consequence? You may have people getting fired, unemployment rising, and so on. So this is another and final example of an environmental policy that actually is not even necessarily environmental, but it's an industrial policy going in a new environmental direction that has consequences on employment. Okay? So I hope that these examples not only triggered more curiosity, but made you understand that today it's increasingly important for a number of reasons to focus on the interconnections between social goals and environmental goals. Not because, and as we will see, we are going to adopt a normative approach. As you know, when we think about normative approach, we're thinking about how things should be done. So typically there has been a discussion. One of the articles we're going to look at, because it has a nice table, was produced by a UK-based scholar, Jan Guff, who explicitly says, if we don't do something, he's a scholar, not a politician, but as a scholar he says, if we do not do something now, it's going to be a catastrophe. So there's a high normative input in the literature. And of course this is very good, but on the other hand it's a bit problematic because then analytically speaking we may have some issues. If, as you know, as young would-be researchers, when you study whatever thing you study, you have to make sure that you distinguish opinion from facts. Of course, not always it's that easy, but in this specific case, what we need to do is to distinguish what we would want society to look like and what actually society looks like. A joke, for example, that some colleagues of mine say, well, you're working on eco-social policies, but you're working on nothing because they don't exist. And to a certain extent, it's partially true, and this is why today we're starting with welfare states, eco-social welfare states, because there are very limited eco-social policies to date. There are some, just transition is one, but there are not too many. If you focus on the welfare state, you can have a full bachelor degree, or you can have a master program. You cannot have a master program in eco-social policies. You can have a bachelor and a master program in eco-social challenges, because there are numerous. But still, they have not translated effectively in policies that we find in several countries. So as we will see, there are some policies, but we're still in the preliminary setting, if you wish, of understanding what are the challenges and what has been done so far in terms of gaining awareness of the issue. So it's not surprising, to conclude on the normative aspect, it's not surprising that some scholars have become advocates of eco-social policies, because they argue that something has to be done in order to avoid a full catastrophe. Of course, this is done also by environmental scholars, not only social welfare or social policy scholars, but still it's on a normative perspective, which is wonderful, but it has its own limitations, because if we want to understand facts and understand what's really happening in reality, we need to go into a slightly different direction. And that's what is going to happen today, what we're going to try to do. We will just start with some references to the literature. We have some welfare state literature that you know very well, so I'll be very rapid on this. I don't want to repeat things that you already know. Maybe you're a bit less familiar with environmental state literature, I guess. So we'll have a few references, but again, not too much. And in case you're interested, you'll find plenty of references in the articles. Then we will try to problematize and politicize the issue. And then I'll present a piece of work that I did with a German colleague of mine, Katharina Zimmermann, working at the University of Hamburg, which was one of the attempts to map the worlds of eco-social welfare states. So here I'm going to really go through this very quickly because you should know everything about this slide. Just a reminder, we all know that the welfare state throughout the world has been a consequence of social rights expansion, and it has developed in a number of policy areas. So welfare state covers many policy areas, pension, healthcare, social inclusion, increasingly education, employment, increasingly housing. Again, we could say that also the welfare state has been defined differently, but roughly speaking, we all know what we're referring to when we talk about it. And we also know that there has been a huge expansion during the so-called Trente Glorieuses, the 30 years that go, roughly speaking, between the end of the 40s, mid-40s and mid-70s. And we also can mobilize some explanatory factors. That is, why did the welfare state develop over time? And I'm going to briefly refer to this once again. I'm sure that I'm saying things you already know, but it's a reminder because somehow we will think out loud about these factors also when we will look at the environmental state development and therefore at the development of eco-social welfare states. So, as you know, we have the classic model of workers and trade unions pressures, the Nordic countries that were pushing as social movements, as labor movements, pushing in the direction of obtaining protection for social rights. You have more business-oriented pressures, for example, in the case of Bismarckian Germany, that were going into the direction of avoiding possible revolution and therefore conceding protection of new rights for the workers. And finally, we have the French story, and I'm simplifying things brutally. I hope you're not offended, but again, these are things that you should know very well. So I'm going very quickly. The bureaucratic expansion. And the bureaucratic expansion, which is partially the French story, is also a very interesting factor that we'll have to also look at when we will look at the expansion of the European Union, for example. Because lots of the bureaucratic expansion reasons that we find for some countries can also be mobilized, as we will do later today, in order to understand some developments in the European Union, not only in the field of social policy, we'll see this tomorrow, but also in the field of eco-social policies. So this is another exercise you have done already a number of times, and I do not even think we need to just check this. This is a very well-known Fenger contribution. Actually, what we... no, this doesn't work at all. Because there's a chart that would somehow translate all the worlds into a map, but I'll leave also the presentation. But it's a map you can find in this article. And basically, it talks about the varieties of welfare states that, again, you're very familiar with. But this is important for us because somehow it echoes the title. I added an S because, as we will see, we have different possible regimes also in the field of eco-social. So it's not only in the welfare state, but again, it's particularly in the welfare state that we had a number of worlds. And again, if we had time, and if ever we want to, we can come to this later, we could also unpack the so-called post-communist Europe that clearly today is an old term that should be substituted by other terms, and this is exactly what is needed to be done, and to a certain extent it's what we will do. And if we go on the environmental state, most likely we will say something new. Just very similarly to the differences that we may find in the welfare state, we also have differences in environmental policy provision. So when we're focusing on environmental policies, we also need to understand that policies may be different. And therefore, we have different worlds or states of environmental protection. And we have some authors. The first or rather one of the most convincing distinctions in my view, distinguish between established, emerging, partial, and weak environmental states. And here you can easily understand that the criterion was the intensity of environmental protection. Let me underline this very briefly. Let's never forget that in whatever classification or typology we may work on, we always need to ask ourselves, what is the criterion that is used in order to classify? Because classifications may be very useful or may be very confusing, because if there's no criterion, then you could just name whatever you want without having a real understanding of reality. If you classify, you have to distinguish, and you have to distinguish following one criterion. So here we have a very clear criterion, which is intensity of environmental protection. Established, high intensity; emerging, going towards high but medium; partial, low; and weak, no or very limited. And then we have another attempt, which is also convincing, but has some more limitations in my view, and this is also the view shared by Katharina Zimmermann, my co-author. Here the distinction is a bit more articulate on the nature of the economy, green economy more or less, and on the productivist character of the economy of production more or less. And here we have three combinations possible. So here we have more typology: high environmental performance and green economy, high environmental performance and a productivist economy, or low environmental performance and a productivist economy. So we have different cases that may be found in an analysis that tries to cover. So the main message here is that also in the case of environmental analysis or environmental policy analysis, we need to consider the fact that we have many possible variations. We don't have one environmental state. We have several paths towards environmental protection. And this has to be considered when we try to combine the two. Yes? Sure, please.
About the productivist economy.
Yeah.
What do you mean by productivist economy?
So it's a productivist is much more keen in extraction and therefore highly polluting, with reference to economies that are less polluting because they're less, for example, focused on carbon production, are much more on alternative energy, or are service economies with less production and more service. So with this respect, but again, this is the distinction that may not be that convincing. We do not have that much time for this, but clearly if we had to take this and use it for other purposes, we would have some issues, I think. But anyway, the distinction is made on this basis. More or less polluting in terms of more extractivist and therefore more linked to an old-style type of production economy, with reference to other types of economy that are much more focusing on green production and service that is friendly in terms of environmental protection. Yes, sure.
You use usually green economy, but not green technology. Why it is? Because economy free market, or with some restrictions from what comes from the government, but usually we have impact on nature from technologies, but not from economy.
Right. So again, the green economies, and this is a discourse that has been also supported by the European Union in a number of occasions, is economies, that is also production worlds, that are fully considering the consequences of the development model adopted on the environment. So with this respect, you can have a green economy thanks to a green technology. So you may not change the production, but you have changes in terms of the ways through which the production is done, and you can make it less consuming. So you could have a smaller environmental impact. With this respect, a green economy can be made by green technologies, but it may also go in other sectors. So technology may be or may not be relevant depending on the focus of the economy itself. Again, questions or comments on other sides? Everything clear so far? Yes, almost. apparently. Shall I take a silence as yes? Usually it's how it works, but okay, I'll do that. Hopefully I'm interpreting your silence correctly. Jan Guff, the scholar, the brilliant scholar I was telling you about, who has this normative tension, which is again very laudable, at the same time has also developed an analytical reading of, in this case, in particular, both the development of environmental state and the development of the welfare state. And simplifying a bit, but not too much, he identifies 5 key triggers of the development of environmental state and the development of the welfare state. So, industrialization, and clearly this is something you know very well with reference to the welfare state, but if you think about it, it can be also seen as very convincing with reference to environment. The environmental policy issue becomes relevant in a number of countries only towards middle of the 70s, between the early and the end of the 70s. And why does it become relevant? Because industrialization had reached a peak of high productive capacities that had also a side effect on the environment. It was growingly clear that the environment would have been affected by heavy industrialization. So it was not simply industrialization equals workers' protection, because otherwise if you're injured, nobody will pay for your injury and you cannot work anymore. Welfare state development. But it also valid for the environmental state. Then we have this classic distinction, which I would criticize heavily if we had time, but since we don't, I will just take it as it is, and I'm sure you have developed this analysis also with reference to the welfare state, so I'm sure you have provided your own criticism to this. Interests, institutions, and ideas. I will not go into the details of each one of these simply because, again, we could put into these categories different things, and so we'll just take them together under the form of bureaucratic politics on the one hand, that is governmental preferences. We will somehow mobilize the factors we already mobilize here. So if we go into interests, we're talking about workers and trade unions, workers' movement, we're talking about business association, we're talking about also institutions, we're talking about governments, about bureaucracies. So we have this reading of expansion that is connected to specific preferences and interests on the one hand, and also specific institutions that may base their preferences on ideas that may be connected to policy developments outside of the country. And talking about outside of the country, international constraints and opportunities. So there has been a relatively big literature on globalization and social policy. As a matter of fact, if I read correctly, one of your textbooks or several chapters that you're going to use in your MA or BA program is explicitly devoted to globalization and social policy development. Not surprisingly, because over the past 20, 30 years, that has been one of the topics, as we'll partially see tomorrow together. But also think about Europeanization. Not only globalization counts, but within the European Union in particular, we cannot avoid but think about the relevance of Europeanization, European ideas, the ways through which European ideas and policies are built by the countries themselves. Because again, when we think about Europeanization, we're not simply thinking about the impact that Europe has on domestic policies, but we're also thinking about the ways through which European policies are built. So I don't want to complexify things too much, but if we get these factors together, then we also have some ideas on what we may want to look for if we are interested in the politics. So keep this in mind, because we will somehow get this back into the picture later on when we'll focus on the second presentation after the break. But so for the moment, I just wanted to show you the worlds that we're going to look at. On the one hand, we have the welfare state worlds or models. On the other hand, we have environmental state worlds or models that are the ones that, and here comes the research question, can or cannot be mixed. we started by saying that one of the reasons why we should focus on eco-social policies or politics is that it's vitally important that the world goes in a different direction. Also with respect to the impact of social policies on the environment. EPCC, what is it? I on purpose did not write the full name of the institution. What may be EPCC? International Panel on Climate Change. Not surprising that you do not know it because you're focusing on social policy. But it's also important to know that in these reports, we have an increasing amount of evidence that tells us that there are consequences not only of human behavior in general, but of policies, specifically transport policies, food policies. Have you ever thought about, I'm sure you have, but let me put it a bit rhetorically. Have you ever thought about the impact of the food you eat? I'm sure you have, but if you can check, not now, but afterwards you can check a number of Google sites and whatever, and you'll see that the impact of meat and the impact of a vegetable is very different. So again, going back, think about social policies, food stamps, quote unquote. You could give food stamps only for organic, meat-free diets. Of course, some will say, you're crazy, completely crazy, because it's against my rights of eating meat. Fair enough, but we could also say that it's against the rights of those who may not be on the planet due to the fact that we're destroying the planet. And I'm doing this in a bit provocative manner just for you to get the possible conflict. You may have not thought about this. Usually we have some data that shows that the young people are thinking increasingly not only about their diets, they always have, but about the environmental impact of the diet. So if we look at, for example, vegetarian or vegan diets, they have increased over time, and in particular, if we look at a distribution of the frequencies of these types of diets in the young profiles, you find it more in whatever European country you're looking at. But again, this is not a food policy seminar, so let's just put aside this point, but we have increasingly evidence that is also included into the reports of this international panel on climate change, because it's part of the problem. So we have normative interest. But I'm not a politician, although sometimes I would like to be one, but I'm not. I'm a scholar, and I'm interested in political science and social policy. So I'm not just motivated by how I would like the world to be, although it's part of the story, to be quite honest, but I'm more motivated by a political interest than by a policy interest. The political interest is the fact that we have, as we were mentioning before, a growing number of protest events that are connected to environmental consequences, environmental policy consequences on specific social groups. So we have a very powerful political interest. I'm sure you all read about the farmers that were marching on Brussels just a month ago, a couple of weeks ago, right? And what was the point there? Why were farmers marching on Brussels? I don't remember exactly what day. It was a Saturday. You had 1,000 vehicles, massive, huge vehicles that were going to Brussels. And why were they protesting?
We had in Vilnius as well.
I'm sure. This is why I'm asking. So why would, because you had it in Vilnius, you had it in the countries, but then they went to Europe. They went to Brussels, right? So it was a multi-level protest event. Fascinating, we're starting to study it, but we don't have good data yet, so I won't say anything about it. But just out of curiosity and out of reading newspapers online, because typically the real newspapers are not read anymore. But what did you think, or what did you understand of why these vehicles were going, these agrarian people, these rural people, these farmers were going so convinced in Vilnius, but also to Brussels? Why were they doing that?
Regulations coming from Brussels.
some regulations.
Green Deal.
Sorry?
They were against the Green Deal.
Partially, well, this is one of the stories. One thing was they were against specific provisions of the Green Deal, the European Green Deal. And then they were also against a trade agreement with Latin America that would have allowed, with a lower cost, to hundreds of products from Latin America to come to Europe. So it was a protectionist protest, but it was also an anti-environmental protest with reference to the European Green Deal. So once again, it's not only the Gilets jaunes, and I could mention a number of other very powerful protest events that have been organizing throughout Europe. Just to give you, again, an idea of how spread out these initiatives, these protest events are getting. And, of course, we also have something that deals with recent events. Especially after the war in Ukraine, we had growing attention to some specific policies that were aimed at targeting a phenomenon that has been there for a while, but became even more relevant, that is energy poverty. And here I have something for you, if I manage to launch this, because it should be online, and you should be able to see this fairly easily. This is, let's see if, no, this is too small. Just want to give you an idea, just the chart is what we need. I think you can see it also towards the end. If not, this is one of the reasons why it's good to be in front, if I may go back to that. Anyway, if not, I'll just tell you some of these figures. So, yeah, it's not an easy thing to read, even if you are in front, quite actually. So, here you have inability to keep home adequately warm. This is 2018, so it was even prior to the war, and this is the most recent data I could find, so I do not have 2023 or 2024 data, but I'm sure it would be more if we did not have special policies that were adopted by the government. And quite frankly, I do not know, in case you will tell me about that, because I'm not an expert on Lithuanian policies with this respect. But the striking thing is that you have 7.3 of the European population that states that they're unable to keep home adequately warm. And you have 28%, 27.9 in Lithuania. Then you have a number of other elements that are less strikingly different. But let's just focus on this point. Inability to keep home adequately warm. And we have 30% of the population, which means 1 out of 3. It's huge. So this means that energy poverty is particularly high. But before, which could be the case, of course, no point. Just wanted to somehow bring some information regarding your country in order to make it hopefully even more interesting. But just think for a moment about the question that was asked. Inability to keep home adequately warm. Do you think that the question is well asked? What's the problem with this question from an eco-social perspective? Again, the question is, how enable are you to keep, this could be the question, to keep your home adequately warm? What's the eco-social problem with this question? I'll give you a full minute. I'm not going to fill in the gap. Yes?
Some people keep their houses even warmer than they have.
Perfect. This is exactly the point. How warm is warm? Is warm 35 degrees, 16 degrees, 21 degrees, 19 degrees? And it's not that we simply care because we want to control. I'll be right with you in a second. It's not that we care because we want to control people, but if we heat at 18 degrees, instead of heating at 25 degrees, we have an environmental consequence, which is quite significant. So if I simply consider that adequately warm means warm in a way that may be effective negatively on the environment, then if I provide funds in order to make a person feel adequately warm, I'm, yes, making the person feel adequately warm, but I'm polluting and creating some consequences unless I have a wonderful energy system that is completely renewable, but this does not even exist yet. And therefore, I have to consider the issue. Yes?
I think you already mentioned that, because what I wanted to tell is about what kind of energy is used, whether it's coal or solar or wind energy. That's also important.
Absolutely. But see, this question does not capture all these things. So, again, it's not a problem of Eurostat or a problem of the questionnaire, but it shows us still how difficult it may be to think in purely eco-social way. It's a policy aspect that, okay, what kind of energy do you produce? Is it entirely renewable or not? Well, of course, even renewable energy has some consequences, but clearly much less consequences than traditional energy. So already there would be a trade-off and there would be a choice that could be made. Yes?
Also, is this factor calculated in whole Europe? Or
Yeah, this is a question. This is only. This was a fact sheet on Lithuania, but you have it on all the European countries.
So what I'm thinking about is like hotter climate countries that they actually cooling their homes during the hot.
Absolutely. This is a very good eco-social point. So we should not ask, but there would not be energy poverty in that case unless you ask a question. You are enabled to keep your home adequately cool. For sure, and this could be increasingly an issue, by the way, so it's a very good point. We do not have that question yet to my knowledge, but it could be another question, and you may have in Portugal or in Spain or in Greece or in southern Italy, you may have figures that are very similar to the ones that you may find.
They
Yeah.
now have. I think they now have, and also they adjust a bit other indicators of material deprivation, and now it's material and social deprivation, because it's previously was able to own a car, which is
Exactly.
now able to have access to a car, like, or it's formed in a different way. Yeah.
This was exactly my second example. Beyond energy, you have, again, what is poverty? How do we measure poverty? This is energy poverty, but altogether, how do we measure poverty? And what do you consider as being absolutely poor or relatively poor? So again, as you see, there are some changes that are getting incorporated into the policies, but these are very limited for the moment. But that's why I argue, trying to respond to my nasty colleagues that say you're working on nothing, that actually there is something going on. We have some changes. Maybe they're marginal for the moment, but yet they are the beginning of something that will become increasingly relevant, or at least this is my take, together with a number of other colleagues that luckily are not as nasty as the one I was referring to earlier. So, we can go to the research. We still have, I would like to have another 30 minutes to leave 10 minutes for your questions and comments, if this is okay, or maybe even more.
Yeah, it would be good to have questions and comments.
Right. Yeah, so maybe 15 minutes is better, so I can reduce it. Okay, so I'll go over for another 20, 25 minutes at the most. How many worlds of eco-welfare exist? And is there any overlap with the world's models of welfare state? So I will not going to focus that much on the environmental state because it's not the topic you may be interested that much. And it's not, by the way, my topic because I was not an environmental scholar and I'm not an environmental scholar. I'm a social policy scholar myself. So I'm getting to this literature thanks to other colleagues that told me or showed me how this other world has been studied. What did we do together with my colleague Katharina Zimmermann? Hierarchical cluster analysis, and absolutely the competence in doing this was of my colleagues. Full transparency here, full disclosure. We designed the policy analysis together, but again, I did not have the technicalities in my knowledge to do this, so this is about collaborating with people that can integrate their knowledge. And we did it in those countries where we had data, and I'll show you what data we wanted to work on. 26 EU countries plus the UK, that is not, as you all know, in the UK anymore. We didn't have Malta and Cyprus. We also had, actually, it's 25 countries plus Norway. So we didn't have Cyprus, nor did we have Malta. So actually, let me just correct this in order to avoid any confusion, because then if I forget to change it now, then if I give you the slides, you will have the wrong piece of information. So it's 25 countries that actually our part of the European Union. We didn't cover two others, and we covered also UK and Norway. And we based our analysis on various data sets. One is the Yale Center on Energy, Law and Policy, Eurostat, and some others that you are very familiar with. What did we do? Actually, before we do this, what would you do if you had to try to answer this research question? How many worlds of eco-social welfare exist? What would you have done?
Review the factors by which I will cluster the countries.
So one thing would be to, again?
To review, to find the factors by which I cluster the countries.
Right, so the first issue, rightly so, is a measurement issue. I have to find indicators. But what kind of indicators of eco-social. So what kind of indicators will I mobilize? And here you have different choices. We made one choice, but you could select another one. Our choice was to focus on outputs. Rather, we're focusing on outcomes. We decided to focus initially on outputs, but at the end, we looked at outcomes similarly to some other pieces of the literature, but we're not looking on actual policies. For example, we're not looking at the number of unemployed that are covered. We're not looking, for example, at a coverage figure. So the number of people that are in need that actually are covered by the policy. This could be one option. But if you go back to Espen Andersen's first 3 worlds of welfare state, and you all know about it, basically there you had a combination of both. You had the Gini index on the one hand, but also you had taxation, policy. So we focused on 3 ecological performance indicators and 3 social performance indicators that captured the eco-social situation. And our assumption is that the situation is also a product of a number of policies that we're not actually focusing on. So it's not only a product of policies, but also a product of policies. So we have indicators that are already available in the literature, in the data sets, so we did not have to do all this on our own. Environmental health, ecosystem vitality, which again, I'm not going to go too much into the detail because they're a bit technical, but you find them in the paper if you're interested. And domestic material consumption, which is the higher it is, the higher polluting it is. Clearly here it's clear that health and vitality, the higher the indicator is, the more the ecological performance, the higher the ecological performance, and in this case, the more the consumption is, the lower the ecological performance is. Okay? And the social performance, nothing new to you. Gini index, unemployment rate, and then following some suggestions that we found in the literature, we also decided to focus on the long-term unemployment rate, which is actually considered to be an indicator that captures a bit more accurately what we're interested in terms of performance. So I don't know how much you will see of this, but let's see if we can do it at a very low cost. Here you have so let me make this a bit, just to give you, this is the descriptive statistics. You have, again, we're not going to read the data, but just to give you an idea of how we proceeded, here you have information on the various countries regarding the various variables. So, for example, just to give you, let's see if we can, yeah. So here we have, for example, Lithuania, average of 88.66, so it's a bit above average in terms of environmental health, in terms of ecosystem vitality the same, and then you have in terms of average of the domestic material consumption is very much over, so this would not be a good quote-unquote point. And then you have on the other social indicators, you have differences with reference to the average. The first is the Gini index. Oh, you cannot see. I can't see it here though. I don't know why I cannot see it in the chart, but here we should be able to see it. So we have yeah, this is the one. So it should be 37, which makes sense. Then you have a 5.3 and another employment rate, long-term employment rate, which is slightly above average, or at least it should be above average, which is, this is it, which is 38.3. No, it's more or less with the average. Again, no point in going into the details, but just to give you an idea of how we had to proceed in order to get all the pieces of information that we needed. So, specific factors or indicators of performances, and we put them together. This is how we conducted our cluster analysis. Then there's some specification in the paper in case you're interested. What did we find? We found 6 clusters, and here you see the various worlds. One is the usual suspect. Cluster number 3, Espinandas is there looking at us saying, hey, well done. By the way, quite curiously, Espinandas, I think, still comes from time to time to Bocconi University, which is a university I teach, and I had, not anymore, I had a small office, and he was right close to my office, and we never got a chance to discuss things because I think that he has more nice and more important things to do now that he's emeritus. But still, I wanted to show him where we were, and maybe he read it, I don't think so. But anyway, beyond the joke, here we have a classic confirmation of a specificity of a set of countries. Also with this respect, in terms of performances, we're not very surprised, again, we'll talk about the cluster analysis later on, we're not very surprised, but on all these issues, the Scandinavian, or rather, including also Norway, the Nordic countries are performing better. Then we have mixed performances that we can look at a greater detail. So, clusters 1 and 3 actually go together, and we have not only the best performers, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and Norway, but if we consider them in terms of their performances, they're not that different one from the other, with reference also to Slovakia, Slovenia, Netherlands, and so on. So we have a good to great environmental health, a good social health, and that's where we have some differences. Mixed Gini, it's a lower Gini in terms of inequality for the Nordic countries, a slight higher for some countries, in particular Czechia and Hungary. But they're not huge differences, so we can easily put them together. Then we have Romania, Italy, and Bulgaria. Of course, when we saw this, we started to think that actually we have commonalities. And as you know, I'm sure, one of the first findings of the literature focusing on Central Eastern welfare state developments was, hey, it's very similar to the Southern European one. And indeed, we have a number of common traits that may have changed over time, but this was one of the first findings in the early 2010 or so. So low environmental health, low social health, high Gini. So this could be the worst case scenario, and Italy is there. Of course, for Italy, just a footnote since I come from there. The big problem with all statistics that regard Italy is that they do not usually adequately capture the shadow economy, informal economy. So for a number of reasons, we have some figures that do not correspond, because we have irregular employment, which is very high. It's much higher than in many other countries, including Greece. So with this respect, we always have to take, I'll be right with you, we always have to take with some caveats these findings. Yes?
Maybe you can explain what you mean by environmental health and also social health.
Right, so as we were seeing, within environmental health, we put together this indicator and this indicator. Their levels of pollution, levels of renewable energy. So there are a number of indicators. These are composite indicators that we put together in order to find what, again, can be seen as an adequate proxy of what we're interested in. In terms of social health, here we have it. It's better specified because with environment, you have so many indicators that you have to make a selection, which may be tough. But we did a number of checks with other indicators, and the picture did not change. Here, we just followed what has been done by other authors, and therefore we took this as good social health, trying to simplify a bit, going towards the end. Then we have the cluster, which puts together some countries from Western Europe and some countries, in particular the Baltic states, Greece and Spain. You have a good environmental health in comparative terms, low social health, and high Gini quite often. So, high, of course, it's higher than average. It's not in absolute terms, but it's in relative terms. And finally, you have UK, Poland, France, and Germany. Weak environmental health, because they're productivist economies, to go back to what we were saying before. Traditionally, especially Poland, good social health, average Gini. So we have 6 clusters, and we could think about 4 possible worlds of eco-social. So going to the conclusion, this was an exercise that was conducted in order to, first of all, try to map out, just like Espen Andersen did in the 1990 with his book, that is still today one of the most cited contribution to social policy, because that's how science works. At least this is what I think that science works. First of all, you have to understand what you're focusing on. So you have to classify. This was hard sciences do it. You had to know what were the names and the species of plants, of insects, of animals, and whatever. So the same is something that has been done in the social policy field. So clustering, the so-called business of worlds, the world of welfare businesses. Some have been highly critical, rightly so, because you cannot only write articles about clustering and about models, because of course, if you change one year from another, things may slightly change. We must say that Espen Andersen's contribution was a wonderful contribution that will last over time, also because most of what he discovered has been confirmed after his studies. The first addition, just again to speak to your studies, is that he was overlooking the relevance of the southern model of welfare state. And as a matter of fact, then we had, after his contribution that was not focusing that much on Southern Europe, we had some other studies that actually pointed this out. But we could argue that any indicator could be put into, of course it has to be argued, but it could be put into the basket, and therefore we may have differences. This is to be seen, but what we realized together with Katharina Zimmermann was that we thought that this was a useful exercise, and we had some other few attempts at the time in order to start mapping the field and then go into qualitative analysis. So what we're currently doing together with other scholars is taking some of these countries and doing more process tracing, politics, and policy analysis in order to see if these clusters are just a statistical artifact. And I'm using this term, you may be familiar with articles that have looked at environmental compliance. And according to some countries were not compliant only because the statistics were not capturing what compliance is. So we could argue that here we just have some data that are not telling the real story. So in the current research projects I'm conducting with a number of colleagues, we are selecting, for the moment we actually selected Sweden, Italy, Ireland, Spain, Poland and Germany as 6 countries, but we may decide maybe to change one and add, for example, we have only Sweden here, we may want to add the Netherlands, but still the point is to get 4 if not 6 countries and go into the details of what has happened over time, because as a matter of fact, again, just like any other clustering exercise, it's a first step of a research. The paper got published, it has good citations, we're happy at the end of the day because there's some debate that has been triggered by it, and as you can imagine, any scientific inquiry, if it's read and if it's, although there are a number of typos in the article, I was just reading it again and said, how on earth, And this leads me to another discussion that we may have among colleagues later on, because some journals should be taken very cautiously rather than others. But anyway, beyond the typos, for which I will ask you to be particularly benign and not too critical, because they were out of our control, but still some of them we already mentioned, but they were never changed. It has to be used with caution, not simply because they're the typos, but because it's a first step in a research process that will continue and has to continue. Otherwise, it will be, okay, Professor Graziano, congratulations, we have a wonderful mapping here. So what? This is the terrible question that usually is asked when you finish a presentation. Okay, so what? What do we care about this? Okay, I'll try to say why we should care. Hopefully it'll be convincing. You'll tell me. So we have some good points of departure in terms of saying, trying to answer to a question. Yes, we can cluster, we can map, and we have some confirmation with reference to the welfare state literature. Not only do Nordic welfare states perform better in terms of social policy, but they also perform better if we combine social policy with eco-social. But we start to find some other elements. If you widen the scope and you're not focusing only on social performances, but you also focus on environmental performances, well, you have other countries that could be considered carefully. So again, the Netherlands becomes intriguing because it would be one of those countries that could be seen as performing well and not being part of the Nordic cluster. Central Eastern European countries can be divided grossly, as they were for the welfare state regime, Alafenger, who was the scholar was telling you about. But again, the results are really very mixed. So we would have to clearly work on this with a bit more caution and attention. And this is a call for collaboration, of course. So if you want to join and we could include easily other countries in our research. And I think there's enough room in our analysis. There's enough relevance of what we did in order to justify a continuation in terms of politics and policies. Mapping, we could do it again and again and again, but that's for the moment, unless somebody comes out with a mapping which is completely different and it has not happened yet, then we will keep it as it is. And we will, as I said, we will take these clusters and these worlds in order to then pick out various countries and become more specific in what still remains to be uncovered, the politics. So do the various factors that we saw in the previous slide, in one of the previous slides, what happens to these or other factors? How do we explain eco-social welfare state? We didn't address the question yet. But even more so, not looking at performance anymore, but looking at actual policies. What do we find? So if you want to continue, we may do it later on. Thank you very much for your attention.
I think it was a very fascinating talk, and a lot of information. Also, some of it, especially with regards to environmental bits, might not be that familiar to many people in this room, I think, but this gives a lot of space for questions. So now we can spend some time for your questions. So please, do you have any to clarify, maybe to point out, maybe comments? Okay, I think I'll bring the mic, okay, so that...
So thank you very much for your presentation. I was just wondering about the classification and the productivist countries, and because it might be taken into account or it might be somehow measured, I don't know, that's why I'm asking. Because it is known that in Europe there is a lot of production and manufacturing is like kind of exported to poorer countries. So is it somehow, I don't know, taken into account, or how is it measured? Or, you know?
Shall we take a few questions, or shall we take them one by one?
As you like.
Okay, so maybe we can take one by one. What do you think?
Yeah.
Again.
Yeah. Okay, this was a.
Okay, so thank you very much for the question. Indeed, this is one of the limitations of what we're looking at. Where, to begin with, we're not using this classification or these criteria because we're not focusing on the types of economy. This could be added in. What we did is merely focus on these indicators. So we do not have any distinction between more or less productivist or more or less green. We have indicators, outcome indicators that regard environmental health and environmental or ecosystem vitality, right? So we do not even focus on the productivist side of the story within the European Union. But as you rightly say, we could, if we went on and focused on the policies, we could then see that some eco-social policies are built in order to simply push away the problem and somehow create other opportunities for pollution for other countries, saving the country with reference to very polluting productivist approaches. So indeed, this is an issue that should be, I think, studied primarily from a very qualitative perspective, trying to look at specific economies. I'm sure you have some data on it. I would not know personally where to look for it, but even if you just try to see what choices are made in terms of polluting or non-polluting or productivist or non-productivist economies, then you would eventually see that one of the best, quote-unquote, eco-social policies is to export all the pollution, which of course in a systemic view does not change things, and this could be an issue in terms of capturing the data and information. What we know, however, is that the European Union, the United States, growingly China, but not yet at the level of United States and the European Union and Australia, are the most polluting systems, economic and social systems altogether. So this does not mean that if you export pollution, so to speak, you're doing something that is useful, but you may not create consequences that are so harsh with reference to what actually is happening in other countries. Of course, it may not be a good option, but I'm not getting into the normative discussion. But from an analytical perspective, it's an issue we have not looked at, and it could be very important to look at, especially if you're coming from a political economy perspective, I would argue.
Okay, I think yeah, it was a good question, and also we can not only export environmental issues, but also social issues sometimes, especially in employment. For example, after the last major economic crisis, yeah, Lithuania successfully exported some of its social issues to the EU. Okay, but now we have other questions.
I have a question on these variables. You use employment rate and long-term employment rate. They are very similar, and they are linked to each another. And my question: why you don't use another? Some say from health, maybe life expectancy. Also, my question is related with the stability of some variables, because employment rate and long-term employment rate is very much depend on business cycle.
Yeah.
And another figures are more stable maybe. Also the question about data, do you use 1 year or certain period, average of certain period?
Right. Thank you very much for your question. Actually, we use an average over 15 or 20 years, so it's an average figure that we're using. We did think about life expectancy and another of other variables that actually were in our data set, but then and it didn't change because we did run some cluster analysis with other, and it didn't change things. But also we were focusing on these because we see them as more directly connected to the policy, so they're outcomes of the welfare state regime, because the life expectancy rate could be connected to, and it is scientifically, so to speak, also connected to a number of personal attributes that cannot necessarily be captured directly by social policies. clearly we could add them and we could substitute them, and again, we did, but the results did not change. And long-term and unemployment, regular unemployment and long-term they're apparently very similar, but we have some differences in data which are quite telling in terms of specific policies that have been developed recently in order to reduce long-term unemployment rate that were very successful. So with this respect, we had in the past 5 to 10 years, especially due to the European Union that was focusing on this much more than specific countries did in the past, we had some improvements and changes that actually we managed to capture thanks to the data. But yes, we could add other indicators or look into other indicators for sure.
Okay, do we have other questions or comments or? Mm-hmm.
The green exchange rate announced by the Commission in December 2019. Why so late?
Sorry, I'm sorry, I didn't get the first part of the question.
European green exchange rate announced by the Commission in December 2019. Why so late?
Are you good?
Another part, all European Union members have seen climate change across the planet before December 2019.
Perfect, yeah. So the two questions are very much connected. If you bear with us for another hour and a half later, that's exactly what we're going to discuss. But I will not want to be so cruel in case you decided not to stay for the following hour and a half, and I'll try to answer briefly. The International Panel on Climate Change has been producing reports for over a decade. And report after report, and they have annual reports and they have sectoral reports. Every 4 months, even less. Every 3 months you have a report, and they always have underlined the disaster that is approaching to a certain extent. So the question is, why did some countries, and in particular the European Union, just try to tackle this issue so radically would be too much, but so seriously for sure in 2019? Why didn't they do it before? Well, to be fair, we have to say that we have different environmental states. So some states have been much more established than others. And we have some rules that were enacted before the European Union came in, already in the late 90s or early 2000s. As we all know, the big debates regarding the future of the planet started after Rio 1992. So we have environmental policy in the European Union already in the 70s, but it's only after 1992 that it gains momentum throughout European countries and also beyond the Europe. So slowly but surely we had growing policy attention, but it's true, and I argue this in another paper that is in the background of my presentation later today. It's true that for 15 years, since 2004, the European Union was not expanding environmental protection anymore. Why? For a specific political reason. As you all know, 2004 was an important moment in the European Union in terms of enlargement, and many of the countries that were joining, I think, I'm not sure, you'll tell me, including Lithuania, had some issues in terms of regulation. And on social issues, I know for sure. On environmental, I will not know. You would have to tell me. But the point of all these countries coming in was, we don't want more regulation from the EU specifically, because we have a competitive advantage on low labor costs, on low environmental standards. Take Poland, if we do not want to look at Lithuania. Again, maybe you'll tell me if this story works or not. But you had a clear push, which is legitimate if we take an analytical standpoint, which is problematic. It may be seen as problematic if you take a normative standpoint. But until 2019, there was no reason for the European Union. Not even Juncker tried to go in that direction. He went, as we will see tomorrow, much more into the direction of social policy at the European level, not in the direction of eco-social. Between 2004 and 2019, environmental issues were downplayed at the European Union. Why 2019? Because von der Leyen needed the support of the Green in order to become president of the European Commission. And again, I'll tell this story in greater detail later, but in a nutshell, she had only 6 votes in the first June nomination, and in order to increase, and she had then 70 votes, and she got the green votes, she had to find something new, building on what was already at the core of the European Union. That was the European Pillar of Social Rights, that you all know about, and the development of social policy at the European level. So this is why I think it's so relevant to continue our research journey, because this is where the politics issue comes in. Because if there are no triggers or no interests or no specific also legitimation quests, then nothing may happen. Just look at the US. Let's go beyond Europe. Look at Brazil. You have evidence of, especially in the US, of how disastrous things may look like if you do not tackle environmental issues. And Trump was simply, in the previous, when he was president, he was not focusing on this. Actually, he didn't have an eco-social agenda. He had only a productivist agenda. Biden was more balanced, in line with research that we see. Center-right, center-left, or conservative or less conservative politicians have different takes. It's politics. It's very much politics. Even if we look at neo-populist parties or movements, inclusionary neo-populists are paying much more attention to the environment than exclusionary neo-populists are. So it's a very, very, very much a political answer that we need to give to this question.
Thank you very much. And also it was a nice introduction, I think, and an invitation for the second part of today's lectures. Okay, now.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed listening for your presentation. And my question is whether you were looking for some indicators which would cover both social health and environmental health. If you were thinking of it, and I came to one idea, what could it be? For instance, the number of social enterprises, social entrepreneurship initiatives, because I vaguely remember some statistics from the UK, I think, and some researchers counted that almost, I think, 2/3 or even more of new enterprises are social enterprises. So I think that's interesting and worth further investigation indicator to cover both, because they are both interested in sustainability issues and also social responsibility.
Right. If we find social enterprises that are also interested in environmental issues, for sure. The way we are thinking it now together with the colleagues is to focus on the so-called green jobs, or even more so, the green jobs incentives, because we're looking at the policy, we're not looking at the development within the market. So we're looking at those incentives that go in the direction that you were mentioning. Again, social enterprises could be one, but they have to be green social enterprises. And not all of them necessarily are. That they may be very important for social purposes, but not always necessarily also for environmental. So if we find an indicator of green social enterprises, that would be great. In the meanwhile, we're looking at incentives regarding green jobs that are provided by the governments, by the countries. Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Or okay, let's see if maybe there is anything from the back of the room or here. Okay, Lina, and then I'll give you a
have you considered the tension between ecosystems and green solutions, so to speak? So, for example, if you build a wind turbine, it might destroy some birds on alter landscape. So, not all, so to speak, green measures are actually good for the whole entirety of ecosystem.
Very good point.
So, have you considered that in your research in some way?
Very good point. No, we haven't. There are some researchers that are doing this. For example, animal well-being, animal welfare. Very good point. We are not considering it simply because the indicator of environmental health or ecosystem. Well, to be fair, we do capture it partially in the ecosystem vitality. That is, I don't think we capture the impact of renewable energy as you would like us to do, but we do have some indicators, sub-indicators that are connected to also animal welfare, animal well-being. It's partially incorporated. But since the focus is to reduce those factors, those polluting factors that are considered by the International Panel on Climate Change, and broadly speaking, considered by the policies that are aimed at mitigation or reduction of environmental damage, then we're not looking at the number of birds that may be killed by turbines. At the same time, we could also make the other argument that we should also factor in, if we think about food policy once again, if you factor in the fact that consuming less meat, you kill less animals, that will be something positive, quote unquote, that we do not put in our picture. So I could argue that at the end, we have some information that is not captured on both sides.
Okay, the time goes very quickly, and I know that Paul also had a late flight, so deserves a break. So maybe Lina, a last question, and then we go for a break. And maybe, if I can propose, then after break we can start with some questions if there are any remaining, or you can also ask directly during the break, although we need to give Paula some time to rest as well. Okay, so
I have a small question about this heating, poverty of energy poverty. For example, in Lithuania, the majority of houses, flats have central heating, and you cannot regulate individually. So how you can count this poverty of energy when you you cannot answer that, you can keep your home adequately. Usually we have mutual house decisions, what temperature you should keep, and some agree, some disagree. But the main issue is that renovation, for example, is going slow. So a lot of post-communist countries have this problem. So
right.
This would be my question.
So, very, very, very good point. That's where you could have, and actually one of the work packages of our project is entirely devoted to energy policy. And the research group from the University of Milano is going to work on this, because this is typically one of those things that we would like them to focus on. My first answer would be that, at least in the Italian case, and we would have to focus on the other cases, regulations are adopted at the municipal level. So there are regulations regarding the maximum heat that has to be provided into an apartment. So even if you disagree as a house or as an individual, you should comply. Now, of course, this raises the problem of compliance. How on earth can you look into 1 million or maybe 600,000 homes if this is what you have in Vilnius, or 750,000 homes in Milano, or 120,000 homes in Padova? It's impossible to implement monitoring unless this is where artificial intelligence and technology could help. Because if you had a mastermind that would keep under control millions of heating services, then that's where you could intervene. Maybe in the future, but now it's impossible. At the same time, the argument could be that it's a policy at the local level in this case that can cope with the issue. So even if an individual would like to have 35 degrees, you simply cannot have it, because rather, it would not be legal to have it. And maybe with artificial intelligence, once you reach 20 or 19 or 18, again, I would like to know what's the adequate temperature here, for example, just out of when we would have, I think, very different answers. If you set a standard and that becomes the legal standard, then the question, it's not that it becomes less relevant, but it's out of the hands of the individual and of the building. It's in the hands of the municipality.
Yeah. Okay, so now we have a break. Let's give Paula another round of applause. And we meet here in half an hour at 5 for the second lecture. Paolo also mentioned that he will share the slides, so you will get this, and as also was announced, there are some background papers that I already have, and I will send them through as well. And so now we have a second part of today's lecture. Actually, I thought that I would start with a small question from the first part.
Yeah.
To take my privilege, to take my privilege as a moderator.
Yeah.
And also to remind ourselves of the first part. Maybe I also close the window so that it's not noisy. So the question is the following. So you have identified these 4 clusters, and also you began the last lecture from this question on how the social and the eco policies, how they relate to each other, and there are also probably tensions because resources are always scarce, yes, or at least politicians always talk, and economists as well, as of resources as being scarce. And you showed us these 4 clusters, and actually Lithuania is doing better than Italy. I'm not sure, maybe that's the wrong interpretation. But then you mentioned this question, so what? You said that this is a nasty question. So I would frame it the following way. Do you think the interpretation would be right to say that, for example, okay, Scandinavia, they have the social situation more or less intact, so they can invest in eco policies. So now they have both covered. And then, for example, Lithuania, we see there is this imbalance, yes, and with the eco side, we are kind of okay-ish. I'm not sure if that's because of the effort, maybe just because of our luck of being in the northern part of Europe and in relatively good climatic conditions. But then would it be an argument to say that, okay, look, the social part is lagging behind, so we really would need to focus on that? Or that would be a completely wrong interpretation?
No, it could be a very adequate interpretation. My normative answer would be, for sure, this could be the case, and there could be a case for policymakers. I know you have often relationship with ministries, and this could be a very good message to underline. But I think that for those who are in a relatively good position, so Nordic countries, to a certain extent Lithuania and others, it could be also a moment to be a bit experimental in terms of finding policies that try to really go beyond classic social policy. So yes, more social policy, yes, but why not more eco-social, even if you're relatively well performing? Because again, this is relative performance. If ever we wanted really to go and take seriously the European Green Deal targets, then you would have to, until 2030, 2050, you have the zero net carbon, zero net carbon economy. So that would require anyway some investments. And again, you could invest in the social as a priority, knowing that by doing green public procurement, to put it very easily, or by adopting some policies that are still focusing on the social, but at the same time considering the environmental impact, you could be even more original, more innovative, because that's something that others are not in the position to do.
Yeah, okay. So now I leave everyone with Paolo and his second lecture, and indeed the Green Deal's indicators were not mentioned during the first one, so now we have a chance to hear about them.
Well, thank you again, and thank you for staying here, most of you. So it means that I didn't really destroy you with my previous presentation. I still see you're smiling, and that's good. So you're alive, which is wonderful. Here I'm going to somehow actually follow up on what we discussed earlier today, because we're going to look at the European Green Deal, which is environmental policy by all means, but at the same time it's a policy that has some social dimensions, and I don't want to emphasize them too much, But nevertheless, I want to underline the fact that within the grand design that was supported by Franz Timmermans first, and Ursula von der Leyen later, although we still would like to know exactly where the idea comes from, because we have not conducted interviews yet, so it's something that we want to do. But in any case, even if the responsibility was more of one of the other, it doesn't really change from an institutional perspective. We had this very important step forward in terms of environmental standards that want to be set by the European Union, and therefore one of the questions was, and actually was the question that we had at the end of the previous lecture, why is it that in 2019 it came out and it didn't come up earlier, or didn't come out that powerfully earlier? So what I'm going to say a bit more about is the politics and the policies of the eco-social. We started with the mapping exercise, and now we're going to go a bit more in the direction of unveiling the politics and the policies at the European Union level. So we're not going to do it at the national level. Also because, and this is where my colleague is right, at the national level you do not have those many policies that have been already adopted. It's in the making. If you take the just transition mechanism, that it's one of the policies we're going to focus on, and actually I will show you the list of the territories, and if you do not know them yet, you will tell me more about the territories. Actually, I will start from there in a few seconds. Territories that are in Lithuania. As a matter of fact, much of that, of what happened at the national level is a European implementation story, European policy implementation story, with a few exceptions. One is the Netherlands, one is Ireland, one other is Spain, but basically, or there are another couple that had something going on, but it's 5 out of 27. So we could again argue that there's not that much going on at the national level. At the European Union level, though, the European Green Deal was very important, so we'll try to focus on how and why the European Green Deal was adopted. We'll say a bit about what it is, but we will focus in this case more on the politics and on the relative policies. Let me just start from here. I'll have to make this bigger if I can. I think, why is it? Just a second. Okay, this should. Okay. So here you have, these are the ones I'd like you to focus on. Okay, so Kaunas I know, Šiauliai I more or less know, Telšiai I must confess, this is my limitation, my limited knowledge. I do not know that much, but Kaunas I visited, Šiauliai, there was a student in Bocconi that was coming from there years ago, Telšiai I would not know. But this is the population, so 580,264 of the county, and 131, so altogether it's roughly 1 million, which is, as you know better than I do, a bit more than 1/3 of the total population of Lithuania. Still, it's a lot. And what we find are countries that may have something interesting for the European Commission, and I'm asking you to tell me, because I have no idea, again, beyond the fact that I visited Kaunas. Why is it that these are the ones that are at the heart of the Just Transition Fund, the JTF? This is one of the measures that we find in the European Green Deal that we're going to talk about. Why do we have Kaunas, Šiauliai, and Telšiai, if that's the right pronunciation? Any idea? One explanation or one hypothesis could be that you had very good politicians coming from these places, and there was no reason on earth for these countries to be in these plans. But I doubt it, because the European Commission always looks for some figures, and you have to justify. Let me see. You have Italy, but this is quite good and curious. Taranto is Sud Sardinia, so you have Italy and Lithuania very close one to the other. This is Ireland, by the way. You have only one territory. Italy, Taranto is a town in the south, in Puglia, which has a huge steel plant, which, as you can imagine, was polluting and polluted a lot over the years. And it's been for about 15 years that their trade-off between environmental, on the one hand, and social goals has been seen by all. So there has been a clash of goals. So although we could argue that some politicians were very good, although I do not know the story yet because we're going to study it, there's lots of, it can easily be understood why Taranto is there. Sud Sardinia, it's actually south west, where we have old mines, and we still have the necessity to convert the local economies into ecologically friendly or eco-friendly economies. So again, these two are clearly at the heart of a just transition perspective. What about these three?
Okay, maybe I have an idea.
Yeah.
Very shy.
Yeah.
Because it is a city in which.
So Telsia is the one you're referring to, or no? Which one?
No,
all three of them.
No, it's not just. I was there some months ago, and I heard about it. That the lake, which is in the heart of the city, was very polluted, and in the last year it was really cleaned, and now the government there are. Yes, the expectation that this lake should stay clean.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Less polluted.
Okay. By the way, thank you very much for asking your question in English. It's my fault if I do not know Lithuanian. I shouldn't, but the only thing I learned for now is ačiū. So I mean, which is not a very big thing. But so I really appreciate this. Otherwise, I could not be here. So quite seriously, and I'm not doing this as a sign of courtesy, but it's the only way we can interact that easily. So thank you very much. You're referring to one of the three in particular. Sorry, which? To Kaunas, are you referring? No. Okay, no, wait. Okay, so this does not go down. Yeah, Telsiai, that's how you pronounce it. Okay, so, but this would be an environmental argument. So we need to find an eco-social argument. What's the social component of this story? What could that be? Again, I have no idea, really. I just decided to start from here.
I imagine that if the lake was really polluted, it affected also people living in the lake.
For sure. But that's affecting citizens, not necessarily workers that will lose their jobs due to the fact that you're going to clean up the lake. You see the issue? So in Taranto, it's not simply the fact that the steel company is polluting, but it's the fact that if you close the factory, thousands of people will lose their jobs. And you have trade unions that are opposing in Taranto, that are although they have been changing their view recently, but the traditional clash 15 years ago was environmental associations on the one hand, trade unions on the other. Bang. Because they were focusing on different goals. The environmental were more in line with ending pollution in the lake, and that's it. Who cares about what happens? And of course, trade unions said, even if we pollute, we need to have a job, because that's traditionally a high unemployment territory. So you do not want to risk it and say, okay, if we close the company, if we close the factory, who guarantees that we're going to have jobs? This is where the transition, the policies, eco-social policies become very important. So going back to Telsiai, what could be beyond the lake?
Some companies.
So, okay, this could be the case. Yeah. So again, this could be, if ever anyone would like to focus a bit more on these issues for a master thesis or whatever, let me know, because I would be very curious. I can do my own research, clearly, but it would be much more fun to have an outcome of our interaction, having somebody email me, hey, remember, this is what's going on over there. So the same may apply to Šiauliai, which this, I know a bit, was one of the heavy industrialized parts of the territory, so I assume that this is maybe more similar to Taranto, not to the mines, but to hard steel producing or steel consuming. Go ahead. Could that be the case?
I think that in this sense, Lithuania is not a very productivist
although Romas can, as an economist, can tell the difference, but I think, well, at least the steel production, I'm not sure if...
maybe there's another heavily...
but there might be just...
heavy pollute.
Yes,
So, anyway, just to take it from the bottom, if you wish, these are all the territories that are part of the just transition policy in the European Union, and you have, again, all of them. In some cases, you only have one, and as you see, the population size varies a lot, and we do not know why. This is somehow what we'd like to explain in one of our pieces of research. How were the territories selected? Why were they selected? What is the rationality, and so on? But this is the broader research question that we're going to address. But before we go into the details of that, and actually we'll not do it today or tomorrow because I do not have findings to share, we first of all wanted to know more about the European Green Deal. So you'll have another article that complements the one that was used for the first presentation of today that explicitly focuses on this. Before I take it more from the research side, let me just remind ourselves about the European Green Deal, because you may simply have heard about it once and that was it. But it's a very, very articulate, we're all interested in public policies, right? We're more interested in social policy, so this is not social policy, but it has some social dimensions. It's primarily environmental policy, but it's very intriguing in terms of a complex policy, very ambitious. As you see, it's a set of leaves. That's how it was thought. And also, I would say, after all, quite original way. So you have the tree that is made of leaves. And all these leaves are aimed at transforming the European Union's economy for a sustainable future. And it includes also some horizon targets, which are of interest also for us as researchers. But this is for innovation and research. But in terms of content, you have these 8 main points, and then you have 2 elements that are connected to the just transition that we just saw. I will read these out because they're impossible to see, so you unfortunately, I'll read them out, no worries, and then you'll have the slides anyway. So, a zero pollution ambition for a toxic-free environment. Clearly environmental goal with a number of policy measures that have been adopted that, again, we are not going to focus on because they were adopted after the approval of the tree. 2019 is the approval of the tree, which was already a huge step. Then, step by step, you had other policies. And one of the policies that we were discussing earlier today about the farmers going to Brussels is the so-called farm to fork policy. A fair, healthy, and environmentally friendly food system. In the rules that were adopted and are going to be supported by the European Union, we had this policy that required for each land, cultivated land, to put aside 4% of what is cultivated on a yearly basis, and that 4% should have been untouched for a full year. So, for environmental purposes. Of course, what's the consequence? The social consequence. You have farmers that typically do not have high salaries or are not particularly wealthy that lose that 4% opportunity to make more money. So, in a nutshell, that's the eco-social policy dilemma. If I want to reduce the pollution of the food creation, then at the same time I may penalize someone much more than others, because you are penalizing, first of all, the farmers. I know it's getting late, and I'm losing some of your eyes, by the way, but I want to make sure that we get to the end alive and kicking, so ask questions if necessary, or I will try to get you in increasingly. Is everything clear? So this 4% is just a simple example of what could be the clash of interests. On the one hand, you have the environmentalists that say, yeah, we want to do this because it's a way to reduce pollution, or rather to save the soil from fertilizers, to put it very brutally once again. On the other hand, a farmer that is forced to set aside 4% of the land will resent it very much, because he or she will lose 4% of the land, and it may seem not too much, but still it's euros that you would lose, and maybe it's just a symbolic element that irritates farmers. So you had farmers in the streets against this provision that was also matched by the other goal that was to go beyond the relationship with Latin America on the agreement. So this is clearly one of those eco-social policy sensitive dimensions, farm to fork. It's also with reference to limitations of individuals' freedom in choosing meat again. Nobody will prohibit meat consumption, or at least not in the near future, but that could be one of the options, to put heavy taxes, and this is the option currently happening, on meat consumption in order to have people go in a more vegetarian or vegetable-based diet. And this is where we have another very hot topic, which is producing meat from cells. I'm sure you have heard a bit about this debate that is going to go beyond meat production and having meat being produced in a more environmental friendly way, but cutting out most of those, or many of those, who are actually having cows and having animals that are going to be butchered for meat. So I don't want to go too much into the details, but I always think that always, also for research purposes, but even more so when we have MA and BA students, it's relevant to really identify what we're working on in order to understand it more deeply. So here we have clearly an eco-social policy dilemma, or a potential eco-social policy content. Preserving and restoring ecosystems and biodiversity. Very environmental, but again, it could be something that has costs. If you want to restore a park, if you want to, the nature restoration law, which is under discussion currently at the European level, attacked by a number of politicians, it's not attacked because people will overtly say, I'm against restoring ecosystems, I'm against biodiversity. They will tell you, I'm against the costs that have to be concentrated over the shoulders of a limited amount of people that will have to pay the bill. Because this is how it would work, unless you design the policy in a different way. So you incentivize, or you find incentives that go in a selective way in one direction or the other. So here we also find some eco-social dilemmas. Accelerating the shift to sustainable and smart mobility. This is a bit more neutral, and actually this is one of those that gave less problems. Because if you think about it, this is the classic green economy dimension, because you have green vehicles, it's virtually an opportunity. You have green technology that may come in, so it's a win-win game.
But also it's going to be controversial, because subsidies for electric cars or for energy cells, for household use, they go disproportionately to those better off, and then you have kind of all these issues like why would we
Right. No, for sure. If you think it as an individual policy measure, indeed, I was thinking more about public transportation, about incentives, which could go. And indeed, that's the issue. They all are policy dilemmas, but at least here it's less it could be seen as less problematic, because it's more easily a win-win game. If it's not that difficult to design it in a proper manner, not even the others would be, but the vested interest here, and to a certain extent here, are much higher. So it's more problematic. Here, you can also design incentives in such a way that, again, who has access to the sun and has the cells that can capture solar energy could share what they obtain with others that do not have access to that, and you may have an inequality or a bias there. So you could be creative in an easy way. You could also, my argument, normative, could be that you could be creative also in other ways, but you have vested interest that would be, take the meat issue. It's you could relatively easily find a common solution, but it's much more symbolic. Meat is a symbol rather than anything else. It's not like just deciding to have a cell. It's just something much more connected to our traditional way of living to a certain extent. And meat has for decades, in Italy at least, but I'm sure elsewhere, has been seen as a sign of wealth. So why shouldn't we eat meat? In the 50s in Italy, you used to have a piece of meat every 10 days. Or once a week it was super party because nobody had, 80–90% of the population did not have the money to buy it. Then it became almost a daily consumption. Just think about eggs, think about chicken, whatever. That's a symbol of wealth. So it's also, from a symbolic point of view, much more problematic. Not only because you have vested interests, but also because you have ideas or symbols that are included in this. Here, it could be problematic, but it also has some way outs, so to speak, in terms of a win-win solution. Then you have the just transition, which is made up of funds, funding the just transition, and make sure that the socio-ecological transition is just. This is the essence of eco-social policy, right? And this is why we're focusing on the territories that you saw, and that's going to be our main empirical focus, because that's where you locally will find, maybe not in Lithuania, because we cannot identify the eco-social policy game, but I'm sure if we take a closer look, we'll find it. There you can identify really in vitro, so to speak, the elements of the conflicts. And you may find nothing, you may find a lot. We'll have to see. For the moment, for example, in Taranto, we don't have that much in terms of policy answer, but we have a lot in terms of policy conflict or of political conflict over the potential decisions that may be adopted. Building and renovating in an energy and resource efficient way. Again, this could be more in line with what you were saying before in terms of distributive consequences. Those who are better off may benefit much more than those who are less better off. So, but this so far has, since it's a policy based or primarily aimed at private dwellings or private houses, you do not have associations of owners of houses, of lower income houses that have mobilized against it. So, and also the policy measures are not that advanced as in the other fields. Mobilizing industry for a clean and circular economy. This is very much similar to mobility, and it's a win-win solution, or can be seen as such, because you want to provide incentives to green companies and maybe green technologies and so on. Supplying clean, affordable, and secure energy. Energy poverty left aside, it could be a win-win. Increasing climate ambition. This is the problematic one of fit for 55, that is fit for the reduction of 55% by 2030, and neutral, European Union becoming carbon neutral in 2050, which is enormously ambitious. This is one of those goals that have actually triggered a lot of protests. So, as you see, it's massive. It's packed with decisions that regard various parts of the policy system. It's not simply about the environment, it's about a way of living. It's a transition altogether from one type of economy, one type of production mode to another type of production mode. So, and here again, of course, we have the political footnote, or the political bottom line, that is the EU as a global leader. And one of the measures was, let's create a European climate pact in order to advance. And I will spare this, but if you go to the website of the European Green Deal, you'll be overwhelmed by the number of policy measures that have been proposed. Some of them have been adopted, not too many. Most of them have been referred to. So each leaf has a timeline from here to, and it was until 2024, but goes on until 2029, 2030, on how to actually make this possible. What happened initially, enthusiasm came out before the pandemic. As you may recall, 2019, we were referring before to this, is when Ursula von der Leyen became the president of the European Commission. And 2019, between 2019 and early 2020 is the period when the European Green Deal was adopted, formulated and then adopted. And it was adopted in a very quick way. It was supported by the Parliament, adopted by the Council of Ministers, supported by the European Council, supported by the European Commission. So initially, it really seemed that the Commission managed in 6 months, 8 months, to find all the arguments necessary to win the political battle, because the European Green Deal was approved. But as we have seen, it's inherently very conflictual. So the question is, why on earth was it adopted? Some are arguing, this was a debate we had a couple of days ago, is it possible that nobody was paying enough attention to the proposal? I don't think so. I will have another answer. My answer goes into the investigating something that is a bit far away, I think, from your specific interests that are social policy, but still it's a politicization hypothesis derived from the European integration literature, more political science oriented, but hopefully it will be of interest for you, which I'll make very, very understandable, I hope, very simple, but I will not speak about the theory. It doesn't matter. The main point is that if we look at what happened in 2019, we need to take seriously the idea that the European Union is not something technical anymore as it used to be until 15, 20 years ago. Most likely for the new countries, it never was something technical, but in many policy areas, it was very far away from politicization, that is, political conflicts. Europe was seen as exogenous to a certain extent to the domestic political system. So whatever happened in Europe then had repercussions on the national level, but the national level was the one where you had protest events and so on. It's only over the past 15, 20 years that you had a Europeanization not only of the policies but also of protests. And therefore, we were trying to see if actually this happened and how, if it was so, how it happened. No interviews, as you see, for the moment. Here we have academic literature and policy documents. We do have some exploratory interviews, but they have not been coded yet, they have not been used yet, but this is going to be the next step in order to become even more detailed in the answers we're going to provide. I think I'll just tell you a bit about the innovations that were introduced by this view of Europe. As you all know, 2009 is the year of the adoption of the Lisbon Treaty within the European Union. And the idea is that the European Union increasingly went from permissive consensus, that was the standard in terms of letting Europe go in one direction, the European Union go in one direction, to constraining the census, that is, politicization under the form of political and policy-based identities that clash within the European political world. So it's not simply about accepting whatever happens, but whatever happens gives birth to increasing conflicts that are connected to the developing of identities and developing also of resources that connect national actors and make transnational policy attempts by those actors that for decades operated primarily at the national level. So it's just, again, making the European Union much more similar to a domestic political system in terms of conflicts, in terms of identity, in terms of elections. Just think about one thing. I'm sure you all know what a Spitzenkandidat is. And I'm using the German word because it's used also in Italy. In 2009, the Lisbon Treaty introduced this figure of the Spitzenkandidat, which is the candidate, the important candidate that, as you know, we're going to have European elections very soon. So one of the Spitzenkandidaten is Ursula von der Leyen now. At the time, there were other Spitzenkandidaten, and they were the ones that, according to the treaty, were supposed to be candidate for the presidency of the European Commission if the elections were won by the party they represented. Okay? This was introduced only in 2009. It wasn't there before. But it's not written in such a way that if you do not do it, you're out of law. No, you're outlawed. you have an opportunity, it's kind of a suggestion. But clearly it's in the treaty, so it should be followed, at least to a certain extent. 2014, it happened with, after the introduction of the Lisbon Treaty, it happened with Juncker. He was the Spitzenkandidat. With 2019, Ursula von der Leyen was not a Spitzenkandidat. And this was one of the first issues that she had to cope with, because she did not have the legitimacy to be the candidate to be the president. So she starts in a very weak position with this respect. And it's a weak position that is somehow underlined by all the actors that are playing the European political game. So she starts out, as we will see, in a very complicated manner. But before we get to the story, let me just finish with reference to the relevance of legitimation. Now, this is something that applies to any political system, but it applies even more so to the European Union, because as we all know, the European Union has been built on nation states and on member states that have their own policy tradition. As you all know, we have no European Union welfare state. We have some European Union social policy. But why is it that we have no European welfare state? You tell me, since this is something that you are very familiar with. Why is it that we have no European Union welfare state? We talked about Scandinavian model. Did we have any model or any world of European Union welfare state? It wasn't there. Why? Take your time. I'll drink some water.
Because of the money and the political will?
Even more than the money, the political will. Say more about the political will. Or you or somebody else. She did some of the job, somebody else should join. She did a good start, somebody else should help. Political will, why do you want to keep pensions at the national level? Why do you want to keep health care? Why do you want to keep unemployment benefits? That's where the political scientist comes in. Brutally.
Maybe we have now European Union state.
Because the politics of the welfare state, as you know, developed exclusively at the national level. This is why the welfare state is at the national level in crisis now, because it's losing some of the references. But if you think about Bismarck, if you think about Beveridge, if you think about any other country that developed the welfare state in the 50s, 60s, 70s, it's a national story. And entrenched, you have trade unions at the national level that want to keep their prerogatives, even if they're very different. Think about Swedish trade unions, or even Lithuanian trade unions and Italian trade unions. So put them together in Brussels, in the the Confederation of European Trade Unions, and what do? They fight all the time. I'm exaggerating a bit, but the point is that you do not easily find that common interest, because they're different trade union models. So you have, in the Nordic countries, you have a model of service-oriented trade unions, which is not shared by some of it, Italian trade unions, which are much more conflict-based or representation-based. So I don't want to insist too much on this, but just to, once again, say why legitimation is so important at the European Union level, with reference to a situation where you always have to fight for one, because you'll never take it for granted. It's impossible to take it for granted. Of course, if you have 80% of the European Parliament on your side, and you have all the political parties in the European Parliament that are strongly connected to the governance at the national level, then it's a cup of cake, as we may label it. And if you go back, I don't know how much European social policy you do, we'll do some reference to it tomorrow, but I'm sure that Jacques Delors is someone you have heard of, maybe not. Anyway, if you take the years between 1985 and 1995, it was a decade where legitimation was not a problem, because you had a French, socialist, and Catholic in a moment where the European policies were entirely made by France and Germany. Again, I'm being a bit brutal here, but this is, in a nutshell, the story. So legitimation was not problematic. The more the European Union becomes big, the more you'll have issues, the more you have conflicts. 2019, it's an issue. And why is it a political driver? It's always an important aspect, but in the European Union is even more important because, as we all know, the input democracy, which is pushing in the policies, pushing in the ideas, is not as democratic as it is at the national level. There are libraries with books or articles on the democratic deficit of the European Union. So it's very much about output democracy, although that the output democracy has also been challenged substantially, because if you think about all the crises and what actually the European Union was not capable of doing that often, well, you see clearly that something is going on. So it becomes even more important now, and we have to think about two dimensions of legitimation. One is the social dimension, which is connected to trade unions, but also to other actors. Which actors could we refer to? This is also a social policy question. When you're thinking about social policy developments, even at the local level, and you're thinking about a social legitimation for an institution, who will you look out for in terms of support? Trade unions, okay. But who else, typically, beyond trade unions? I'll repeat the question. Legitimation can be political, institutional. That's the easy one, because you have political parties and government parliamentary relations, right? So it's easy and it's more political science, so let's put it aside. Social legitimation. Just think about decisions that you're working on in your various assignments in social policy. Just think about Vilnius. You have a policy that is in the process of being formulated, and it regards employment benefits, although maybe it's not at the municipal level that it happens, but let's imagine that this is the case. So you will be concerned of having the support of the trade unions, at least a bit, correct? Just think yourselves as policymakers. You will just say, I don't care at all about trade unions, and I just go for the decision. Well, at a certain point, they may start being in the streets, and you may not like it, because your legitimation may be put into discussion, correct? But beyond the trade unions, who may we find?
Well, businessmen.
For sure. Business associations, very good indeed. So business associations on the one hand, trade unions on the other. But then we also have this world which is increasingly becoming relevant also for social purposes, that is made by social movements. Homeless associations or homeless movements, to remain in the social policy field. Unemployment recipients that are not benefiting anymore and are mobilized because there's a tax, there's a reduction in the benefit. They're not necessarily trade unions, they're not necessarily well organized, but still they go to the streets. So you'll have to pay attention. And therefore, with reference to the legitimation, they are becoming, and we were looking at the local level, but think about, just let me give you a name and then you'll understand everything even more easily. Fridays for Future. You all know what Fridays for Future is. Maybe some of you have also participated to initiatives, or you are militants of Fridays for Future. Well, the Green Party and Fridays for Future, as we will see, in 2019 were crucial for Ursula von der Leyen. I'll skip this, too political science, too technical. Again, if ever you're interested, you'll read the slides, and if you have questions, you let me know. What is, therefore, the socio-ecological paradigm? We are getting to it via examples, but in order to clarify the picture once and for all. Transform the EU into a fair and prosperous society with a modern, resource-efficient and competitive economy where there are no net emissions of greenhouse gases in 2050 and where economic growth is decoupled from resource use. Here we have a number of economists that said it's impossible to do. But again, it's impossible to have economic growth. These are the economists that are in favor of degrowth, a concept that I'm sure you have heard of. or alternative growth, or post-growth. And in Brussels, they are increasingly debating about the post-growth society, which is not degrowth because it would be too radical. Post-growth, post is much better than de, usually, when you're focusing on processes. So this is 2019. This is the point of departure of the European Green Deal. And again, this was very ambitious.
Could I?
Sure, please.
I'm very old, and I remember from my young days that it's very similar to the program of Communist Party of Soviet Union.
Prosperous in particular, right?
Communism in this part of the world.
Right. Yeah, but as you know, the critics of the European Commission always talk about the Soviet-like bureaucracy in Brussels. So if you think about it, quite frankly, the European Commission has plans. So it has 5-year, 6-year, 7-year, 8-year. So it's the principle that supports the European Commission and the European Union functioning has always been a planned, not economy, but a planned type of intervention. But this was the only way out for the European Commission, because if you do not plan, it was the power trigger for the European Commission, because they can set some constraints to the governments. Otherwise, they had nothing in their hands. And again, I don't know how much you are intrigued by the European integration story, but there are a number of fascinating mystery elements in it. And one of them is exactly how the European Commission and the Council, before it became institutionalized, were fighting constantly in order to have more or less power. So it was, exactly the point was, okay, how do we reach this? Finally, the European Commission, with a reform that was supported by Jacques Delors, not by chance, in 1988, managed to impose, quote unquote, on the member states to have this jacket of the planning, 5-year, 6-year, 7-year. Now we have the 2021, 2027. No matter what happens at the national level, if your government changes, you have to stick with what you decided in Brussels years before. If you think about it, it's violent to a certain extent. If you think about national sovereignty in old terms, this is why you have 35% of the future European Parliament that will be made of Eurosceptics and critics of the European Union. This is why Brexit occurred. And it's, if you think it in old political science reading of national sovereignty, is not surprising. So I don't want to push it too further, but taking seriously, yeah, go ahead.
If we remember, I think Lisbon strategy in 2000, yes. And it was said that we will create the most competitive economy in the world.
Smart, sustainable, smart, sustainable.
United States and the European Union, we are behind.
Right, but yeah, so again, we could continue on this. Let me just wrap it up for time. Then if you wish, you can, of course, we can continue later on this. But if you think about the 2020 strategy, it was much less ambitious, although it was at the time enormously ambitious. But if you think at the main target that was set in 2000, what was the main target? The target was to smart, sustainable, and so on. But when you translated the target into indicators, the idea was to reach employment rate, not unemployment, but employment rate by 2020 in Europe that was 75%. If you look at the figures, we are beyond 75%. And at the time, we still have imbalances. Italy is very low, Lithuania is very high with this respect. Above average, Italy is below average. But still, it was very ambitious, but also due to the fact that you had Lisbon set the targets for 2010, and you had the open method of coordination. Then you had the European semester that set the ambitious targets for 2020. Now you have 2030. At the end of the day, it may also work fairly well. And in that case, it was a win-win, because it was, let's reduce unemployment. It was not even reducing unemployment, but it was increasing employment. Trade unions were happy, business associations were happy. With the sustainable issue, environmental associations were happy. Who was against it? No one. No institutional or associational organized interest. Here, it's a bit more challenging. So we have environmental goals, economic goals, and growingly social goals. It must put people first. This is the neo-populist jargon also in the European Commission. And pay attention to the regions. Old story, 1975 European Fund for Regional Development that still is very active. Industries and workers who will face the greatest challenges. So it's very well spelled out. Again, same communication. So here, we're not going to go this, we may get back to it tomorrow. We have the two legacies, the social policy legacy that increasingly went into the adoption of the European Pillar of Social Rights. Again, we can come back to it later if you wish. And then you have the environmental policy legacy. Remember we were talking about this earlier? You had the rise of environmental legislation for about 10 years. It was expanding, becoming increasingly demanding. But then enlargement, 2004, I'm sure you all are familiar with the date. Environmental policy deconsolidation according to some, or dismantling according to other scholars. And again, why? Because you have millions of members of citizens of the European Union that are not that happy. And in 2007, even other millions will not be that happy, or at least the representatives of those countries, including Romania and Bulgaria, will not be very happy about this deconsolidation, about consolidating or increasing environmental protection. So that's what happened. At this moment then, Ursula von der Leyen needs to take into consideration the critical juncture where she is in. What is this critical juncture? It's a critical moment in the development of a policy trajectory or political trajectory. Here we already mentioned one, new, not Spitzenkandidat, president. Barely made it with the first nomination. She had 6 votes more than what she needed in order, it never happened in European Union history. She barely made it, and she made it thanks to PiS. And PiS is the Polish neo-populist exclusionary party that just lost elections in Poland. So you can imagine what kind of a shaky majority she had. And this was in June. In November, she had almost 90 votes more than she had previously. All the Greens, some others coming from other parties, that gave her commission, not only then von der Leyen, but also the commission, the power to go in that direction. Why? Because she had the European Green Deal playing in this favor. But she had the critical junctures represented by the fact that she was not a Spitzenkandidat. She could not rely on legitimation that was derived by the nomination of the parties. She had to win the votes. Then, again, let's see if this works. Wanted to show you the statistics which are captured by Fridays for Future itself, but are quite telling, and they're not. Let's see if we can find it easily. Right, I have, because there was still yesterday, there was another chart. Yeah, maybe this helps a lot. Just not to, right, so this is just to give you an idea. Can you see all right? Yeah. Okay, so again, millions, literally millions of people were in the streets between February and November 2019. Again, maybe you were very young, but maybe some of you were in the streets as well. Fridays for Future, as you know, has this repetitive but very effective idea of having a Friday for Future every Friday. Then they lost a bit this over time, but in 2019 it was the beginning of the movement, and it was very, very densely all protest events were densely populated. So these are the European. You have them everywhere in the world, and you also have several in Africa, but this is where you have the peak. And most of the protest events were organized during the 2019 period, February, November, and even more so in September. There was the strike week, a full week of strikes that regarded the entire world, but in particular European Union. So not only Ursula von der Leyen was not a Spitzenkandidat, but she was also pushed by social movements together with environmental parties and environmental associations in a direction. And of course trade unions were also there, so she had to consider that as well. And finally, we had also the EPCC that we know now very well, being, what is it? Go ahead. Yeah, so International Panel on Climate Change. Wonderful. So here we had data, even more data saying we're really going to go directly to hell if we don't do something. Again, I'm dramatizing a bit, but the point is that something has to be done, and it's not only social movement. So we could also, thinking it out loud, actually we could add another type of legitimation, which is less relevant, but here we could add experts or technical legitimation, because this is what it was all about. But we could argue that it also can be part of a social one. So in a nutshell, you had very severe pressures that were going in the direction of eco-social project that was somehow underlined by all these movements, not in a very coherent way, but it was enough for the European Commission and Ursula von der Leyen in particular to understand that something could be done and had to be done. So just take this away, because we're not going to talk that much about the post-functionalist story, but we had policy innovations at the margins. So we were building on existing legitimate policy legacies, environment and social. Although the environment was a bit more contested, but it became legitimate because in that specific moment, it was going to be a good political exchange coin with reference to those that were needed in order to obtain support. Commission President was triangulating with the European Parliament, addressing and civil society organizations. Oh, by the way, they were not satisfied with the European Green Deal. Not the Green Party was enough satisfied in order to vote the confidence vote for the Commission, but many other actors such as Greenpeace or other environmental associations wanted even more. But of course, realism made it possible for the support to be reluctant. So it was support, but not enthusiastic support. So, concluding and giving another 15 minutes for questions and further comments. Here we have institutional and social legitimacy, both at the European Union level in terms of parliamentary and state-based, governmental state-based legitimacy or legitimation, and social legitimacy with reference to experts, with reference to social actors, both trade unions, business associations, and social movements. In an increasingly contested European political space, this is where, a footnote, the post-functionalist European integration story, in my view, holds a lot, because it would have not happened 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Jacques Delors managed to innovate simply because he was French, simply. It didn't happen before. French, Catholic, and socialist. So all the identities were embodied in one leader that could play a leadership that was legitimate and very powerful by definition, per se. Ursula von der Leyen could not play that game, although she was German and Catholic, but she was by no means socialist, and she was not a Spitzenkandidat. Given the growing conflicts over the social costs of environmental policies, von der Leyen's attempt is aimed at gaining support by intertwining social and environmental policies themselves, putting on the plate some, if you wish, good news for the various actors involved. And therefore, it was policy integration by, if you wish, by chance, because there was no specific vision before Ursula von der Leyen had to do so, but she needed to go in that direction, and Franz Timmermans, which was much more environmental and eco-social, being socialist and coming from the Netherlands, which is not that powerful, could help her out in putting the right ingredients into the plate. And just to conclude, as you may know, Franz Timmermans was the vice president of the European Commission until less than a year ago, when he resigned in order to be a candidate in Belgian elections, which were not very successful for him, but he was the point of reference for the European Green Deal. So for sure he played a very important part. How much of a part he played? Stay tuned, I'll let you know soon enough when we'll have conducted good interviews. For the moment, I cannot disentangle this too much. But the final interesting point, I think, is that the European Green Deal would have not been possible without the previous social policies that had been adopted and supported over the years, or the previous environmental policy, because it could not been, it had to be innovative at the margins, because it could not be radical, as we all know, by social policy or public policy. Unless there's a systemic change, all changes are going to be incremental. It's highly probable they will be incremental. Radical changes are very, very rare, right? Okay, so now, and as you see, this is what was happening in Brussels just less than 2 months ago. Von der Leyen sings ode to farmers, promises action to peace protests. So is this going back to the initial point of departure, that is, let's just scrap out what we did so far? Do we need a new form of legitimation that is going to cancel the European Green Deal? This is what Ursula von der Leyen did in these days. She said, okay, we're going to do what you ask. We're not going to be as ambitious. We're going to change things. We'll have to see what their electoral results are. It's not even sure that she, although she's the Spitzenkandidat now, at least she's the she is formally the Spitzenkandidat, but she's been criticized enormously by the People's Party, European People's Party. So she's a weak Spitzenkandidat. It's much better than 2019, but it's still in a critical juncture to a certain extent. So here, as you know, social science can very rarely predict anything. Economists are even worse to a certain extent, because, as you know, the economists, when they were addressed by Queen Elizabeth, why didn't you see it coming? Of course, for political science, nobody asks, because they know that we cannot do it. But so, I mean, economists are considered to be the ones that can. We are not even considered for that. But if ever we wanted to be as ambitious as the economists, I would say that this is not a turning point in the story, because it's only a conjunctural answer that von der Leyen is giving, because she needs some support, and she needed. These were the days. This is where really process tracing is very important. These were the days when she was really trying to get the support by the European People's Party. So she could not accept and afford any kind of heavy criticism. So she needed to appease as much as possible protests, and that's exactly what she did. Now, if ever she will become president of the European Commission, she will need the votes of the Greens, and there will be of vital importance in order to have the majority. So I doubt that she will really pay that much attention, but she may learn, most likely, and she may reframe eco-social policies in order to avoid this. And by the way, it would have not been that difficult. Remember the 4% land that we were talking about earlier today. Apparently, I'm not an environmental science expert, but apparently that 4% could be kept in production, that is, it could be cultivated, but for other types of cultivations that, by the way, are vegetable-based and only used for food diets, that are even better than keeping the land not used. So at the end, technical solutions, not necessarily green technology, but just thinking more about the problems in eco-social terms, could make you find solutions that could be good compromises. This is one of the, I think, lessons that can be learned by this fight. Once you get at this point, whatever you do will not work. You have to avoid reaching this point as an institutional leader. And again, this is to the end we can include some normative and prescriptive comment. This is what we learn from our analyses. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk, and I think quite some challenge also to grasp the policy at the EU level, while social policy, indeed, you started from that social policy is a national mandate, also in the treaties, yes, like social policies and so on. So we are much more used to dealing with the policies on a national level. But anyway, I think that it was very interesting talk, and I hope that everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. So, questions. Time for questions and comments. Also, it can be, I think, related to the talk, but also this may be broader, I think,
Absolutely.
topics, because
Absolutely.
this is the chance to ask the questions that you want to learn about eco-social policies from an expert in the field. Mm-hmm.
I can start. Maybe you can tell a little bit about. Maybe you can talk about financing the European Green Deal. Are there some funds from the European Union, or is everything in the national level?
Shall we collect a few, or?
Yeah, we can. We
Or
can.
maybe one,
if you want.
one by one, maybe it's.
As you,
Okay.
that's on.
Let me just go back to our territories. Here you have. Let me make this a bit more readable. Now, well, yeah, I do not know how readable it has become. So here you have. These are 65 territories. Again, just two. These are the financial programs. The territories are even more. So you have all these territories which are covering the European Union, and for each you have resources that have been developed. So each program has some funds, and here you have the funds amount. You have the EU preliminary contribution. Let me make this a bit bigger so that you simply see the EU preliminary contribution. Then you have the national preliminary contribution, which is the co-funding. As you all know, European Union very, very often acts following the co-funding principle. So you do not have 100% contribution coming from the European Union, but you have to match funds. So here you have all the funds that are involved, and in some cases we're talking about, for example, in Bulgaria, 1.5 billion. Now, of course, if we take the national budgets, we're talking about small percentages, but these are resources entirely devoted to the transition. They're not devoted to pensions. They're not, as you know very well, up to 50% of GDP can go to social expenditure, right? So it's huge. Here you're not talking about that amount of funds, but you're talking about the funds that may be innovative, that may start to trigger the change. This is the only thing that the European Union could do. This is why the European Union is one level, but if you do not have national strategies, as you do have in Spain, in Ireland, and elsewhere, it will never work. Because although these are funds that, again, here you have the plan of Czech Republic or Czechia, you have 2 billion euros. So the resources are there, and let's see if we do have, the total resource is 1.6 thousand billion euros. So I mean, it's relevant. It's not that relevant because this is over a 7-year period. So it has to be fully understood. But there are resources, and this is why the local level, I'm sure that if we go, where were we, in Siulai, or even if we go in Kaunas, the resources made available are not huge, but they could trigger further changes. Altogether, you have 300 and 350,000, no, 320 million euros, which again is not that much, but just think about the territory per capita does become something relevant also in terms of policies, and you only have, quote unquote, only have 3 territories where you have to develop the program. So it's maybe not, for sure, it's not that much as we could wish or find in other policies. For example, just to give you, France has segmented a lot the territory into parts that may not be very, 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 very big, but still you have millions of people that are involved. So again, we will have to see at the national level what happens, but having 1.5, what is it that we said, 300 million euros for 800,000 people, well, at the end of the day, of course, you're not giving unemployment benefits to people, individuals. Here you have people that are not concerned by eco-social policies. This is why I do think that going at the local, very local level and understanding the games that are going to be played at the local level with this amount of resources can be particularly promising.
And Lithuania also used the funds of the recovery and resilience plans. So, and this is actually quite massive. I think that it was like, I think it was 6% of GDP, 3% in grants and 3% in loans that need to be returned and others not. But yes, this is, I think it's very substantial, and a lot of it goes into all this green technologies, innovation, and so on. Yeah,
as a matter of fact, just a footnote, we are starting from the territories in order also to capture the other funds. Because since we have to select some territories, a classic research question, how do you select your cases? Well, here we have a wonderful excuse coming from Europe, but then once we will select the countries and the cases, because we're thinking about selecting 2 cases per country, although in Ireland we only have 1, so this is why we most likely will add the Netherlands. In Italy we only have 2, which is fine, but in others we will have to make a selection. We will focus not only on the Just Transition funds, but also on all the other funds that have been granted at the local level. So the first mapping exercise of financial instruments will have to be done at the local level as well. Also, maybe one point to add is that this, talking about the eco-social, is that these funds, for example, the RRF funds, they are conditional also upon achieving social goals or reforms. And for example, in Lithuania, it was about tax reform, about protecting minimum income, so making structural reforms. And on this depends then the funds delivered through the RRF. So this is a kind of, I think, an effort to strengthen kind of a grip also on the social part, because there European Commission doesn't have much of tools to kind of govern this part, because it's not in the treaties and it's a mandate of the national states. And I heard that in the future the idea is to continue with in the next financial cycle to make also structural funds more conditional upon achieving different also social goals. So then there is a link between this, but just a comment. Very, very good indeed,
Any other questions or comments or feedback? Okay.
So thank you once again. I was thinking about your comments in the first lecture about and you gave just a couple of examples, like first one was regarding the food stamps. Like, I'm thinking about the solutions, and the solutions like anecdotal you gave, but like regarding the food stamps, that we could kind of decide and to say to the people who get them where they can spend them, or any benefits. So I was thinking, do you actually support such measures, or any other measures would you suggest as solutions? So yeah. So what do you think?
I'm not sure I should thank you for this question because it's quite provocative. On the contrary, thank you, because it allows me also to speculate a bit, right, on possible solutions and possible ways out. One of the, as we said, the eco-social debate has been very much normative. So you have many scholars, both economists, environmental sociologists, economic sociologists, political science, that are identifying possible policy measures. And for example, one of them is minimum basic income, unconditional basic income, but unconditional with reference to economic conditions, but conditional with reference to environmental impact. Although it's not been yet developed like this because it's problematic, but you could start by, my answer is that you should have a policy package or a policy mix that makes it clear that you will not, I'm exaggerating, allow that meat is bought with unemployment benefits. This is extreme, so. Because you are already making available for very cheap, available and very cheap, all the alternative foods that not only are good for the planet, but also good for you. So if you made it possible to inform people of the global benefits, and we're taking the diet because it's the most difficult thing to change, the global benefits of this, the idea is that you are conditioning your support. And in theoretical principles, why should you not? Because you're not imposing that people will not be eating meat, but you're just saying you cannot eat meat using public funds. So you'll have to find something else. Again, knowing that you could find alternative ways of obtaining it, going, if really you're desperate for meat, you will go somewhere where somebody will offer you a meat at the Caritas if this is what you want or whatever. But again, being very, if you wish, imaginative on the one hand and very provocative on the other, you could make the full policy package saying you have so many alternatives that are so good for the world and for you. Of course, that's the complicated, non-liberal part of the story, because you're somehow imposing a condition that may be much more solid and much more problematic than other conditions. Well, in that case, I would say let's do an experiment. Let's do a pilot exercise and see what happens. And of course, again, we know that we have, for example, in Italy, 20% of the population is vegetarian or vegan. In Italy, 12% is a lot. And it was 5% just 10 years ago. So this does not mean that we'll all go vegetarian or vegan. Again, I'm always using this example because it's really a personal element, which is a limitation of an individual freedom, if seen to the extreme that meat is not going to be even sold. But this is not the point. The point is, why should I give you money if you take an eco-social perspective, which is going to be spent against the environment, and by the way, also against your health?
Yeah, so can I follow from
Sure.
here? So thank you for the answer. So the problem, or maybe, I don't know, how you would justify it, and I'm vegetarian for over 10 years, so it's not a problem, but the problem is, yeah, with the justification, and if comparing with China's social credit system, how could you justify it? Just only, yeah, you kind of suggest to limit the freedoms of people, but yeah, there's so much more.
No, clearly you would be very much criticized. This is why nobody is really taking this seriously from a political perspective. I can say whatever I want because nobody listens to me, so it's wonderful. This is great. For being experts and professors means that you can say whatever you want and everybody will say and nobody will do anything for what you said. So it's students, unfortunately, are somehow forced sometimes to take notes and then respond to the exams. But otherwise we are completely non-influenced. So we were not. typically, unless we say what the leaders want to listen, of course. As you know, the consultancy business is held by this principle that I outsource decisions I want to make in order to have an external legitimation. So roughly speaking, the same also occurs in decision making. So you become very vocal and people listen to you when you say what politicians want you to say. So this is something that politicians would not want to hear, because it's very radical and it's very problematic from a principled democracy perspective. But again, my argument, this would be very much close to Greta Thunberg's argument to a certain extent, that is, we have no alternative because we are not realizing what's happening to us. So in terms of, I don't want to be catastrophical here, but IPCC, if ever you want to get depressed, look at just one of the pages of the, but it's devastating. I mean, I'm trying, you know, if we have to die, let's die smiling. There's not much you can do. But at least if you try not to die, you will smile and try to find alternatives. And this is the reason I would say politically, in order to support such a radical perspective, which again is not only dealing with diets, but it's also dealing with transportation. Why should we have cars that in cities are not necessary, pollute, make it impossible to reach from one point of the city to the other in a reasonable amount of time? I'm not talking necessarily about Vilnius, of course, because at least as far as I see, things are operating very nicely. But in Milano, where I happen to spend some time, or Rome, or Paris, or you name it, or even Padua, which is not a big city. Again, it really is a paradigm. The eco-social paradigm is something that can be very painful to a certain extent, but it can be also very promising on the other side, on the other perspective, from another perspective, because again, the alternative is really that at a certain point we will have floods, we will have growing mass migration, speaking of which, again, we still already have issues that are unsolved. So on this, you may find the good arguments if you convince people before, and you have to be very, very informative. But it's not an easy task. Again, if I were a politician, I would not really know how to go in that direction in order to win elections. If I want to lose elections, but say I said what I wanted, it's very easy. I could just have 0.01 vote, but I said the real thing.
Okay, I think our time is running out. Is there any pressing question? Because then I will maybe ask myself. Why not? Yes. You mentioned in the very end that there is a chance that this eco-social agenda will be rolled back. Do you think it's really possible, or actually not that much? Because I think also, well, you talked a lot about how these critical junctures brought us where we are, but I think it's also a bigger picture is that already it was mentioned the Lisbon strategy. EU tried to position itself as the bloc where the economy is thriving and we're the leaders in global economic growth. It is not the case and would not be the case for many reasons. But then in sphere of ecology and in social sphere, Europe is really a region which is like leading the globe. So it's like a part of identity, and really there were many crises, like economic crisis and then Brexit and everything, and there was this search for an identity. It seems like this is the new identity. So what is your opinion? Will it be easy to roll it back, or really is it just like a fashion, or just there for at time bit, or is it there to stay?
The pictures we saw at the end were showing that it is a very contested identity. It's very contested in the streets by farmers now. It's very contested in lobbying circles in Brussels by a number of companies. Automotive sector in particular, but not only. So I'm not so sure that it is an identity that has grown in a non-contested way. It's an identity for sure for some, and that's why the European elections are going to be very, very important, because if you have the bare majority that von der Leyen had, even with the Greens, then temptations of going in other directions may become very, very powerful. Just think about the support of Fratelli d'Italia, which is the party of the Prime Minister from Italy, that may go in the direction of von der Leyen. As, again, rightly so, you're not fascinated by Italian politics, so you do not read the news on a daily basis about Italy. But currently we have this internal battle between both parties are neo-populist, exclusionary neo-populist. One is Fratelli d'Italia of the Prime Minister, and the other is the Lega, which is an older party. And Lega and Salvini are creating alliances with Le Pen in France and many parties that are also far right, like also Chega in Portugal and many others. And we had just yesterday actually a meeting with these Identity. Actually the group is called Identity, as you know it. So they're against von der Leyen, and they're clearly not going to be supportive, and they're the most extreme, if you wish, Eurosceptics. But on the other, you have Fratelli d'Italia, governmental prime minister, that has shown support to von der Leyen so far. And it really depends on the numbers, because if she will have a bare majority that will be supported by the Greens and by Fratelli d'Italia and other parties that are similar to Fratelli d'Italia, there's a huge question mark, because it's another endogenous critical juncture, and the result may not be that easy in terms of building on the previous legacies. My suspicion is that, looking at the polls, the results will not be as problematic as we just depicted them. So it could be possible that maybe with not 470 votes, but 440, 450, with the same majority, Ursula von der Leyen may make it. So it could continue. But let's not forget that the 470 votes were not then confirmed when the various leaves of the European Green Deal were approved. Because in some cases, on the glyphosate, for example, directive, which was not even part of it, but was environmental policy of the past, the Parliament decided not to decide, that is, not confirm the ban, but wait for other years. So you see so many vested interests that in principle, at least, you may see a confirmation of the European Green Deal. But then if you trace the policies and see what actually will happen, it really depends on the electoral results.
Okay, so I think that we need to thank Paolo for today's lectures.
Thank you.
And we meet tomorrow in the morning. And thank you very much for everyone who has participated. And we'll send you the slides and the background.